29th of July 1976, New York, USA. 18-year-old Donna Lauria and her 19-year-old friend Jody Valenti had returned home after a night out. As they sat talking outside Donna's apartment, a man approached and fired 5 times into their car.
They represented everything that he hated, everything he resented. They were people with their lives ahead of them. They were out having fun.
Donna died instantly and Jody was seriously wounded. The gunman was 23-year-old David Berkowitz, a delusional loner who christened himself the Son of Sam. He took 5 more young lives in just a year.
Some people called it the Summer of Sam. It captivated everyone. It created fear. The frenzy of activity was like nothing I'd ever seen.
People genuinely were afraid to go out. You cannot overestimate or exaggerate just how much that fear gripped the city.
The killings prompted the largest police manhunt that the city had ever seen.
What he did to those families, they've been devastated and never got over what happened to their children. Bad times. It was bad times.
Berkowitz was a serial killer who had an obsession with the occult. He murdered and maimed 13 young people in just over a year, spreading panic across the city that never sleeps. That makes David Berkowitz one of the world's most evil killers. April 17th of April, 1977, New York. When courting couple Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau were shot dead, a letter to the chief of police from their killer, Son of Sam, was left at the crime scene. With 5 young people now murdered, detectives knew they had a serial killer on the loose. A wave of fear descended on the city, as former reporter Brian Cates remembers.
These series of shootings really did grip the city. People avoided going out late. This was a time of sex, drugs, and disco, and many of these shootings were involved in lovers' lanes and around discos. So you began to sense this growing fear, particularly among young women. People could talk about nothing else.
The fear of Son of Sam was fueled by a battling press, hungry for the latest scoop on one of the biggest ever stories to hit the city.
I was in New York in the 1970s, and the crimes literally hypnotized the city. They were everyday tabloid headlines. Son of Sam terrorizes people afraid in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. It was as though the city was afraid to take a breath. It literally grabbed the imagination of New York.
At the height of the killings, New York City Police Department had 75 detectives and 225 patrolmen working to hunt down the killer. A former detective on the case, Bill Gardella, remembers how the hysteria even led to women changing how they looked.
Once it was determined that he was targeting young females, and maybe by coincidence they had long brown hair, women were going to the beauty salons, buying wigs, blonde wigs, or dyeing their hair. No case can match the frenzy and the fear of the Son of Sam killings.
At a time when New York was the murder capital of the US, even Berkowitz's killings left an indelible mark on the place known as Fear City.
If you think at the time that this happened, women's liberation, rights for women, but all of that freedom, all of those liberties were suddenly curtailed because there was this monster on the loose.
This killer story begins on the 1st of June 1953, New York. David Berkowitz arrived into the world under the name of Richard David Falco. He was born out of an affair between his biological mother, Betty, and a married Long Island businessman called Joseph.
she became pregnant. He essentially said that he would not adopt the child, he would have nothing to do with the child, and David was given up for adoption.
He was adopted by Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz. They renamed him David.
They were a middle-aged couple, Jewish, working class, and they had no children. So I think this was a family which was set up for happiness, really. You have this childless couple, you have this baby that needs a home.
At the age of 7, David learned the hidden truth through a slip of the tongue.
He heard the word adopted from his adoptive father, and they had to explain to him what that term meant.
I think that probably made David very, very uncomfortable. I don't think he could grasp it.
Soon the happy-go-lucky child became disruptive and difficult.
At one point, I understand, they enlisted the help of a therapist or a psychologist to deal with his disciplinary problems, both at home and at school.
Berkowitz never really gets along with his peers. He doesn't form particularly healthy relationships with them. He's a kid who always flies off the handle. He has poor behavioural control, so he becomes increasingly isolated.
But at the age of 14, Berkowitz's world fell apart.
His adoptive mother dies from cancer, and he's facing a loss here. But I think the culture at that time was still very much, we don't talk about our feelings, so this would not have been a helpful thing for him.
A few years later, his father remarried. David was not happy about that. It made him angry, and this is where we begin to see the growth and real rage in his personality.
On the 23rd of June 1971, at the age of 18, Berkowitz joined the army to escape the strains of home. Here he learned to use weapons including the M16 rifle and trained as a sharpshooter. Whilst he was serving, he chillingly wrote in a letter home to a friend, "All of these courses will come in handy one day." He cryptically ended his letter by writing, "One day there will be a better world."
Berkowitz wrote saying, "I've learned things in the army and I'm going to use them." Well, it's maybe a bit of bluster, but maybe also a horrifying first note in what would become a desperately criminal career.
After 3 years, Berkowitz decided the army wasn't for him, so in June 1974, at the age of 21, he returned home. But his father soon left New York when his hardware store was robbed, leaving his son alone in the city. Berkowitz had dreams of becoming a firefighter, but instead had to settle for low-paid security work. The night shifts provided endless hours for him to ruminate.
Berkowitz already sees himself as an outsider. He's not settled. He feels hurt. He knows he's a loner. He knows he can't relate very well to other people.
So this is when he starts to become quite dangerous.
Feeling increasingly isolated, Berkowitz decided to track down his biological mother, Betty. He found her and sent her a poem on May the 11th, 1975, Mother's Day. Betty was over the moon to hear from her long-lost son, and they arranged to meet.
She's delighted to see him, and they have this wonderful reunion, apparently. And they continue to meet, and they have this kind of loving relationship.
But soon the love for his newfound mother would sour.
He meets his half-sister. This was the child that his mother didn't give away. And he realizes that he was a throwaway child, and there's this other child that's been loved all this time by his mother. And he becomes furious.
It's believed this rejection by his mother as a child was the genesis of Berkowitz's hatred for women. Once again, isolated and alone with his paranoid thoughts, he wrote to his father. "Dad, the world is getting dark now," he said. "The people, they are developing a hatred for me."
So what he's doing in this letter is presenting himself as the victim, saying, "Poor me, I have this horrible life now." And he's essentially saying to his adoptive father, "It's your fault because you left me."
I'm sure at that point he is building yet more fantasies that he's been rejected, not just by the world, but by women.
That November in 1975, Berkowitz spent a month in isolation in his apartment. He nailed blankets over the windows and scrawled dark ramblings on the walls. "In this hole lives the wicked king," he wrote. "Kill for my master," was another.
I think this was attention-seeking behaviour, and he gets very frustrated that nobody comes to check up on him. I think there's a kind of sense of entitlement there, that other people should be looking after me.
On December the 24th, Christmas Eve, a delusional David Berkowitz decided to make his scrawlings about killing a reality. He left his self-imposed exile armed with a hunting knife. He wanted to seek out revenge for the rejection by his birth mother. Now the ex-soldier was on a mission to kill.
He was in the area of Yonkers, and he had a knife with him. And he walked up to a young lady, started stabbing her. She screamed, left, went a couple of blocks away, and started stabbing another lady. She screamed, and he left. Only one of those two ladies reported it.
I think the timing is really significant here because Christmas, it's a family time, and I think it's when Berkowitz is feeling the most resentful towards people who have things that he doesn't. I think the thing that he would have come away with is, I enjoyed that, I liked harming them, but I didn't achieve the outcome that I wanted, and that was to kill them.
That evening, Berkowitz reflected on his failure. In the coming months, he would try a change of tack.
David Berkowitz, to the people who knew him, was this kind of puzzle of many pieces, and many of the pieces didn't fit, so that there were some who saw this happy-go-lucky, slightly shy, helpful young man, and others who saw this angry edge.
Berkowitz developed an angst-ridden obsession with one of his neighbors, retiree Sam Carr.
His neighbour's dog, Harvey, barks during the night, and he finds this really annoying. And he will ruminate about this, he dwells on it.
On May the 13th, things came to a head when Berkowitz threw a petrol bomb into Sam's backyard. Scared for his life, Sam reported it to the police, but they couldn't find the attacker. Meanwhile, Berkowitz continued his reign of terror, setting fires in nearby apartment buildings.
When we look at young people who engage in this kind of behaviour, fire setting is a way of them maintaining control. It's an externalisation. They have these feelings, they want to do something with those feelings, and rather than turning it in on themselves, they turn it outward to start harming other people and other things.
Soon the world would know of David Berkowitz. After his knife attacks failed, Berkowitz decided on a different weapon of attack. He illegally brought a gun that he could use with cold, calculating precision, a Bulldog .44 caliber revolver. On Thursday, July the 29th, Berkowitz was stalking the streets of the Bronx.
David Berkowitz was driving in the street looking for his next victims.
18-year-old Donna Lauria and her 19-year-old friend Jody had been out playing backgammon at a local bar. They'd returned home and were sitting in their car outside Donna's apartment.
They were chatting to one another when all of a sudden, out of the blue, out of nowhere, the passenger side window explodes. And what's happened is that Berkowitz has gone into a firing position, extended the gun with both hands, and fired 5 times into the car.
Donna was fatally wounded in the neck. Her friend Jody was shot in the thigh. Berkowitz fled as Donna's father, having heard gunfire, rushed down from his apartment to the scene. But nothing could be done to save his daughter.
It turned out that the bullet recovered was a .44 bullet from a Bulldog revolver, which was a rare gun. David Berkowitz said that when he left that scene, he sang a song on the way home because the demons had told him to go out and kill, and he killed.
I think he quite enjoyed that high, that kind of elevated sense of status of taking someone else's life. He's targeting young people who are happy, people who have their whole lives ahead of them. And he feels, actually, I'm entitled to take that away from them because they don't deserve it, and I do.
The police were puzzled at the motive for the shooting and wrote it off as a botched mafia hit. Berkowitz was disappointed that his first killing didn't create headlines in the press, as he later revealed to the police.
After that first murder, in August of 1976, David Berkowitz was at the Westchester County Mall, and he said nobody recognizes him, as if somebody should know who he is. And he says, "I wish I had a machine gun."
In an attempt to gain the recognition he so desperately craved, 3 months later, on the 23rd of October 1976, David Berkowitz struck again. This time he targeted a couple on a date in the nearby borough of Queens, in a so-called Lover's Lane.
An individual by the name of Carl De Niro is parked with his girlfriend, sitting in a car at night, and he's sitting in the passenger side, and Carl De Niro has long hair. It's believed that Berkowitz thought De Niro was a girl.
Berkowitz shot into their car, hitting 20-year-old Carl in the head. To Berkowitz's disappointment, Carl survived, and his date Rosemary was unscathed. A month later, he stalked the streets of Queens looking for more victims. In the early hours of the 27th of November, he found 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lamino sitting on a step.
He then walks over, says a few words, and shoots, and flees the scene. Miss DeMasi survived. Miss Lamino is confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Devastating injury.
Berkowitz had once more failed in his quest to kill again. But his time would come in the new year of 1977, on January the 30th. 26-year-old Christine Freund was on a date with her fiancé, 30-year-old John Deal, when Berkowitz spotted them.
He parks not far from where that couple was, and he observes a Christine Freund sitting in a car with her fiancé. Runs up to the car and shoots Christine Freund, killing her instantly.
Christine was shot in the temple and in the neck. Her fiancé John ran to get help, but Christine was later pronounced dead in the hospital. The young lovers were about to tell their parents about their engagement before Berkowitz took Christine's life in his second fatal shooting.
None of the Berkowitz shootings were seen as particularly unusual until the murder of Christine Freund. And here, for the first time, police said that they saw some connection between this shooting and previous shootings. Now we begin to see that there might be something more than a series of isolated shootings.
3 days after Christine's killing, a 16-man homicide task force was established by the New York City Police Department. A pattern was emerging of a killer who had a hatred for women. Just like his stabbing victims, Berkowitz was targeting females with long, dark hair.
They were in lovers' lanes, around discos. Berkowitz clearly had problems with women. He said later that he saw his mother sitting in those cars when he shot the girls.
A pattern was also emerging of the killer's fascination for a particular location, lovers' lanes. It is believed that Berkowitz was a virgin.
There could be a voyeuristic element. I've never had sex myself, and I bet they're about to have sex, and I want to see what it's like. I do believe that there may have been an element of trying to destroy his mother. What is clear is he's completely off the wall.
Berkowitz had now shot 6 people and killed 2 women. Barely a month later, on March the 8th, he was back out on the streets of Forest Hills, Queens. The brazen killer was now gaining in confidence. This time he chose early evening and a lone victim.
College student Virginia Vascarichian is walking down the street. The time of 7:30 is much earlier than the previous incidents. She's walking down the street and the assailant is approaching her. She sees him pull out a gun and she puts her books in front of her head and he shoots through the books and kills her instantly.
Once again, Berkowitz fled the scene, even saying hello to a passerby.
So when we look at Virginia, his third murder victim, he's starting to increase in confidence now. He feels quite invincible. He feels kind of elated. He attacks her in the middle of the street because he feels untouchable. He feels like he can get away with it.
What was it that made him change his modus operandi? I think he just felt like experimenting. He's been in this state of collapse, if you like, this fugue of horror, this terror reign for 15 months.
A single bullet from Berkowitz's .44 Bulldog revolver had penetrated 20-year-old Virginia's skull. When pathologists removed it, it confirmed the police's suspicions that they had a serial killer on their hands.
They did a forensic comparison and found that the same gun used on the Freud shooting was used in the Vaskerichian shooting.
2 days after Virginia's murder, New York City Police Commissioner Michael Codd held a press conference. He told reporters that they were on the hunt for a serial shooter.
He announced that the bullet was a .44 caliber bullet, that it was fired from a Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, and that it was linked to at least 3 killings. And for the first time now, we see officially that all these shootings are linked.
For serial killer David Berkowitz, his murders now made the headlines that he so craved.
For the first time, we had a name for the killer, the .44 caliber killer. It was a perfect tabloid headline, and any time there was a shooting, young people involved, reporters went scrambling to find the story. Now, the city is in Berkowitz's palm. He's got the city now where he wants it. He's accomplished what he wants to do, which is to have the city in total fear of him.
Even though he'd taken 3 innocent lives, the killing wouldn't stop. Berkowitz enjoyed the drama that was unfolding. He watched the news and took clippings about his killings as trophies. New York's #1 news story was now spreading fear in the city.
People read the story. Girls begin to worry. Parents wouldn't let their kids out for late-night dates. People began to see a pattern in these shootings, that the victims were pretty young women with long brown hair. Girls began cutting their hair, dyeing it blonde. There was an overall growing sense of fear.
The NYPD's Omega Task Force, now investigating the shootings, was boosted from 16 to a 30-strong team. But Berkowitz wanted to make an even bigger splash across the newspapers. Barely a month after being christened the .44 caliber killer, he would strike again. But this time his hunting ground was the Bronx.
On April 17, 1977, Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau at 3 a.m. in the morning were parked in a car. When the assailant came up to the car, put his hand on the hood, and fired through the front windows.
18-year-old aspiring actress Valentina died within a minute of the attack. Her 20-year-old boyfriend Alexander died 2 hours later in the hospital. Berkowitz had successfully fled once again, but this time he had a surprise in store.
They found a letter that had been left by the killer for Detective Joseph Borelli, the Omega Task Force leader. And the killer complained that he had been referred to as a woman hater, and he was angry about that.
Despite this, Berkowitz stated in the letter, "I love to hunt, prowling the streets looking for fair game. Tasty meat, the women of Queens are prettiest of all." For the police's psychological profilers, they were convinced this message revealed his motive was a hatred of women.
What was interesting about the note, the spelling was good, but he always spelled the word women incorrectly. He would spell it W-E-M-O-N. If you changed the W to a D, you would have demon. Now, whether in his mind women were demons or what have you, but he was threatening to commit more murders as a result of that note.
He's wanting recognition, he's wanting attention now for the things that he's done. But he's also saying things like, I don't belong on this earth. In other words, I am better than everybody else.
Chillingly, one of Berkowitz's last lines of his letter to Captain Borelli warned, "I don't want to kill any more. No, sir, no more. But I must honour thy father." Most disturbing of all was the name he signed off as, Son of Sam.
It was the first time we had any mention of this name, the Son of Sam. And immediately, his moniker changed from the .44 caliber killer to the Son of Sam. And no one at that time really had any clue of exactly what that meant.
He wants that brand, that identity. You can see that this is someone who thinks very highly of himself, and he's quite disappointed, I think, that he hasn't had that recognition that he feels he deserves.
What the press and public didn't know is that the Sam Berkowitz was referring to was in fact his neighbour Sam Carr. Berkowitz was also sending this same neighbour threatening anonymous letters about his Labrador, Harvey.
He's disintegrating in front of his own eyes, let alone anybody else's. He's living alone. He's obsessed by the fact that his neighbour's dog is barking all night.
Berkowitz's torment came to a head on the foggy morning of April the 27th, when the ex-soldier shot Harvey the dog from his apartment block with a .22 caliber rifle.
This is a man falling apart, literally. He's convinced that he's hearing voices, that his neighbour Sam is influencing him, and that the dog is sending him messages that he must commit demonic acts.
Luckily, Harvey was not seriously injured, and with no clear view of the shooter, the police had little to go on. A month later, at the end of May, Berkowitz crafted another taunting, cryptic letter, this time to Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin.
Jimmy Breslin was the top columnist in New York. So, if Berkowitz wanted publicity and wanted to find someone who could take his story to the people and whose story would then be read, Jimmy Breslin was the man to do it.
In the letter, Berkowitz told Jimmy, "Sam's a thirsty lad, and he won't let me stop killing until he gets his fill of blood."
The city room was flooded with police officers. And then, for the first time, the Daily News wasn't simply reporting the story, the Daily News was the story.
Son of Sam's letter confessed to the murder of his first victim, 18-year-old Donna Lauria, and he asked Jimmy Breslin to celebrate the anniversary of her killing.
This prompted outrage among everyone. So we had in that story not only the infuriating letter that Berkowitz had written saying that Donna Lauria was a wonderful girl and she should be memorialized, but also her family's reaction to that, their anger, their deep, deep sadness and grief, all came out in a single column by Breslin.
A lot of people have interpreted this as some kind of affection, some kind of love. But what it is, it's about ownership and possession and control. And for many serial killers, the first victim is a very significant one, the first time that they start to feel like they're in control. So that's why there's an importance attached to her. There was no feelings of affection whatsoever.
As newspapers battle for the latest scoops on Son of Sam, Jimmy Breslin's letter was published in the weekend edition of the Daily News to achieve maximum impact.
The letter wasn't published until Sunday, when the largest circulation would be available. The public release of Berkowitz's letter to Jimmy Breslin did create a frenzy and a fear in the public and among journalists.
The media spotlight on the case resulted in 250 calls a day to the police hotline, with people reporting suspicions about neighbors, boyfriends, even their husbands. With the pressure of having to catch a serial shooter on the loose before he struck again, the NYPD even planted decoy female mannequins in parked cars to try and entrap the killer.
I think the biggest challenge was to get him as quickly as possible, because you knew this wasn't going to be the last time he was going to kill. That was the pressure that was put upon, I think, all the investigators at the time, and the fact that you knew that it wasn't going to end.
Sure enough, on June the 26th, Berkowitz struck again, shooting another man and woman in Queens. Luckily, they escaped with minor injuries. But his next attack just over a month later in Brooklyn would whip up a wave of hysteria that New York City had never seen. On the 31st of July, 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz went out on a date with 20-year-old Robert Violante.
That was their first date, and both Robert Violante's parents and Stacy Moskowitz's parents were concerned. And Stacy and Robert both said to their respective mothers, he doesn't go after blondes. He doesn't go after blondes. They felt that was going to be the case that night.
After dinner and a movie, Stacy and Robert headed to a park in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Berkowitz was also cruising in the area looking for his next victim. He pulled up close by.
Berkowitz fired 4 times into the car and fled back into the park. Stacy remained in the car, seriously injured. Robert Violante blasted the horn, got out, staggered, and was leaning against the light pole.
Robert was shot twice in the face. His left eye was shattered, and he was left permanently blind. Stacy was pronounced dead in the hospital 38 hours later.
When he struck in Brooklyn, I mean, there was hysteria within the city. The New York Post had on the front page, "No one is safe from the son of Sam." The number of calls that came in to the hotline was overwhelming. People now felt he could go any place, and he did.
So that people who thought that they were safe before no longer had that assurance. Suddenly he was all over the city, and his victims were changing. So clearly that created a whole new element of fear that hadn't existed before.
It is the most horrifying crime. People genuinely were afraid to go out. You cannot overestimate or exaggerate just how much that fear gripped the city.
He'd taken 6 young lives within a year, and the serial killer was the talk of the town. Berkowitz was relishing in his rising notoriety. The New York Police Department now had 225 patrolmen and 75 detectives working full-time on the case. Former Detective Sergeant Bill Gardella was brought in to investigate the latest killing of 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz next to a park in Bensonhurst.
I was awakened in the middle of the night. They said, "Sarge, it looks like we got a shooting in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Maybe the son of Sam." I jumped out of bed, got dressed, and drove over to the scene at Bay 17th Street in the park. We were then given other detective units in Brooklyn to assist in questioning as many people as we could. No one was safe. He could strike anywhere.
Whilst Detective Gardella and his colleagues were hot on the trail for any leads, New York's rival newspapers were also on the hunt for a scoop on the latest killing. Former news reporter Brian Cates was sent to the home of son of Sam's 6th victim, Stacy, where he met her mother, Nesha.
Nesha Moskowitz was stunned, really, by her daughter's death. We talk about what a beautiful girl her daughter had been. How could this have happened to us? And then she'd fall silent. She'd look down at the floor and then look at the pictures she had of Stacy and start to cry. Sitting through this experience of grief was very difficult as a reporter. You have this great sympathy for this family, for this horrible death.
Meanwhile, Detective Bill Gardella and his team were on the hunt for witnesses who may have seen her killer. 3 days after her murder, on the 3rd of August, they had a breakthrough. They found a 49-year-old woman who'd been out walking her dog just minutes before Stacy's shooting.
She observed a male coming in her direction, and he was carrying something in his hand. I don't know what it is, but I was upset. I was afraid. I pulled my dog, went back, made a U-turn, went back into my apartment, and a few minutes later, I heard shots.
This new witness had seen a car being booked by a patrolling police officer for parking next to a fire hydrant. When detectives checked, there was no record of any tickets being issued.
She insisted. I saw a summons being given out. We checked a second time. No summonses. We went back. She insisted so much, we'll give it one more try.
Fellow NYPD detective James Justice was sent to meet the patrolling officer on duty that evening to see if he knew anything about this elusive parking ticket.
When I was able to speak to the uniformed officer, he informed me what had happened, that he had left it in his locker.
And sure enough, there were 4 summonses given out. One of them to a David Berkowitz that lived in Yonkers. That third attempt picked up that summons. If we didn't make 3 efforts, we would have not got Berkowitz then.
Finally, David Berkowitz came onto the police radar. When Detective James Justice called Yonkers PD, another stroke of luck meant the dispatcher who picked up the phone was the daughter of Berkowitz's nemesis and neighbor, Sam Carr.
Weed Carr happened to live with her dad in an apartment house right behind the apartment house that David Berkowitz lived in. And she related to me various stories about Berkowitz and their association with him and the problems that they had with him, and the fact that Berkowitz shot their black lab.
He was also told about another neighbor who'd been receiving strange letters and had recently found a fire burning outside his door. The neighbor suspected Berkowitz was to blame.
The strangeness of what this guy was doing, and the fact that he wasn't related to Sam Carr, but the name Sam was there, and I put this all in a report. My inspector asked me how everything went, and I said to him, I got a gut feeling we have the guy.
2 detectives from the Son of Sam investigation were sent to Berkowitz's apartment on Pine Street, Yonkers. They found his Ford Galaxy parked outside and cautiously peered in through the window to see if there was any incriminating evidence.
They look into the car, and on the floor of the rear of the car, there is an Army duffel bag. And protruding from the duffel bag, we thought was a submachine gun, was a semi-automatic rifle.
The detectives found that Berkowitz's car was unlocked.
They enter the vehicle, and they come up with a letter addressed to the Suffolk County Police Chief. The letter stated, "You can't stop me, I'm coming out." And this was the straw that broke the camel's back, to split the case wide open. This was the Son of Sam.
Detective Sergeant Bill Gardella was called with news of this exciting find. With 5 of his NYPD team, they rushed over to stake out Berkowitz's apartment block. 4 hours later at 10 p.m., their patience finally paid off when the killer approached his car.
I took my gun out, ran down the sidewalk as fast as I could to confront Berkowitz before he had an opportunity to go for his gun. And I screamed at him, "Police, don't you go for a gun." And he slowly turns his head like this and smiles. So, "Well," he said, "you got me. What took you so long?"
I think he knew that this was coming. He knew he wouldn't be able to get away with it forever. But this is someone who is very used to being in control. And he remains in control. He smiles, which I think the police find quite unnerving.
Once handcuffed and arrested, on the journey in the police car from Yonkers back to New York City Police Headquarters, serial killer David Berkowitz was ready to indulge in his newfound fame.
Berkowitz says, "Hey guys, I guess the press is waiting for me at New York City Police Headquarters with their cameras. Can you do me a favor? Can you comb my hair?" He's going to serve a life sentence in jail. He's concerned about his hair. And then when we pulled up to police headquarters, there were a few people on the street screaming. And I told the captain that was with me, "Cap," I says, "I want to go in the garage." He said, "Bill, no, let's get our pictures taken." The mayor was at police headquarters. That was the end. That was it.
New York Daily News reporter Brian Cates was on a night shift when he got the news that Son of Sam had finally been arrested.
Everybody was abuzz with this. There was jubilation in the city. And in fact, there were parties at bars and clubs celebrating the fact that he'd been captured. There was a collective sigh of relief that the police had got their man and that hopefully the killings were over.
There's no question that Berkowitz would have gone on. He would have killed again and again and again until he was eventually stopped The classic serial killer. They don't stop until they're caught.
The police had captured Berkowitz just in the nick of time. Using the semi-automatic rifle found in his car that weekend, the son of Sam was planning a mass shooting. Detective Sergeant Bill Gardella was one of the first police officers to search his apartment.
Anytime I speak about his apartment, my body starts to chill because it's something that I had never seen before. He had photographs of all the girls he killed on the floor. He had cut them out of the newspapers, and he had holes in the wall. Voices used to come out of those holes to tell him to go out and kill. And he used to try to stop the voices by hitting the wall. And then he would write a note next to each of the holes. One of the notes I pretty much committed to memory. It said, "Hi, my name is Mr. Williams. I live in this hole. I'm raising little children to be killers. Can't wait until they grow up." It just was a sight I never forgot. And it's the only thing in my lifetime that if I talk about it, I get the chills.
Strange satanic symbols were also scrawled across Berkowitz's walls. During the police interviews that followed, he confessed to carrying out the shootings and claimed that the devil was talking to him through neighbor Sam Carr's dog, instructing him to kill. When it came to his trial, psychiatrists were split on whether he was mentally fit to stand.
These claims that he was hearing voices, that his neighbour's dog Harvey was essentially talking to him and this was the voice of a demon. I think this is nonsense, to be honest. I think this is just part of his performance of trying to appear to be insane, because he's been caught now and he wants to secure the best possible outcome for himself. And that outcome will always be better if you claim you're not responsible for what you've done.
In the end, Berkowitz was deemed fit to stand trial, as it was ruled he understood the charges against him. But after consulting a priest, son of Sam had an unexpected surprise up his sleeve.
His lawyers wanted him to mount an insanity defense and go to trial. Berkowitz determined that he would not do that, that he would plead guilty, which he did, meaning that there would be no trial.
On the 12th of June 1978, 25-year-old David Berkowitz was finally sentenced to a total of 365 years in prison.
This is someone who's never, ever going to be released from prison. And I think he would have gone on to kill more people had he not been arrested. This man is incredibly dangerous.
But the name Son of Sam is indelibly marked on the city he terrorized.
That fear was fueled, of course, by the media. At the time of his last murders, the entire world reported on the capture of David Berkowitz. That's how far his reach extended.
He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it for sex. He did it because he felt like it, because he wanted to. And that makes him a very evil man indeed.
Berkowitz mercilessly gunned down and killed 6 young people who were merely out enjoying themselves. He brutally wounded 7 others, leaving them with life-changing injuries. He terrorized a city that's still living with trauma of his crimes. That's what makes David Berkowitz one of the world's most evil killers. On the 1st of April 1990, Arizona State Trooper Michael Miller pulled to the side of Interstate 10 in Casa Grande to inspect a parked truck. When he peered through the windows of the cab, he couldn't believe what he saw. The face of a petrified woman chained up like an animal. He immediately handcuffed the truck driver and put him into his patrol car.
I think he was probably thinking, how am I going to get out of this one? What do I do now?
Way back to bed, invite you back. I think that's about as far as I've ever gone.
Michael didn't know it yet, but he'd apprehended a cold-blooded serial killer, Robert Ben Rhodes.
He is without doubt one of the most dangerous men ever to have stalked the American highway.
For over a decade, Rhodes had been raping, torturing and killing vulnerable women across the country. But he'd remained completely undetected.
I think that Robert Ben Rhodes is probably the most evil person I've ever met in my life. and I've met a lot of evil people.
The police were only just discovering the gruesome crimes of Robert Ben Rhodes, one of the world's most evil killers. When 66-year-old Robert Ben Rhodes pleaded guilty to the murders of Douglas Iskowski and Patricia Walsh in March 2012, it took his official tally of victims to 3. But investigators suspect he's killed dozens more. It's believed that the long-distance truck driver was active from the mid-1970s, preying upon vulnerable hitchhikers and sex workers across America.
Rhodes's victims were people who would readily get into his truck. He wouldn't have to coerce them to do so. He's looking out for people who are vulnerable. He's looking out for people who need help from truck drivers and motorists. So these are individuals where he already has the access and he already has the opportunity.
It was a routine check of his parked trailer by an Arizona state trooper in April 1990 that led to Rhodes's dark secrets being revealed. The truck driver's horrific crimes may have been discovered accidentally, but it would take the ingenuity of 3 detectives across 2 states to help bring the serial killer to justice. Detective Michael Sheely first heard the name Robert Ben Rhodes while investigating a murder in Illinois.
He'd been a truck driver for a long time, and gave him a great deal of opportunity to find victims at local truck stops along the interstate, hitchhikers, which we know were victims. So he had a great deal of opportunity for such a predator as he was, and that's exactly the words that he is. He was a predator.
FBI Special Agent Bob Lee worked with Michael to find out more about Rhodes.
He not only kidnapped women, but he kept them and tortured them for as much as 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And that made him a special kind of evil as I saw him.
A decade after Rhodes had been imprisoned for murder in Illinois, Texas Ranger Brooks Long uncovered 2 more victims of Rhodes.
I would say that he had the ability to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was able to coerce people to trust him and gain confidence in his good old boy laid-back attitude. But once he had their trust and their guard was down, then you saw the real Robert Ben Rhodes come into play.
The story of this transient killer begins in November 1945. Robert Rhodes was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He was mostly raised by his mother, as his military father, Ben, spent a lot of time overseas.
So there are periods of time when Rhodes's father is away from the family home, and I think there's a sense in which he perhaps misses him. There's a sense in which the family feels incomplete, and there's a longing for an attachment to his father. But when his father returns, he's quite brutal, he's quite violent towards him. So I think he did feel this conflict about his relationship with his father all the time.
It was a relationship that soured further when Rhodes was a teenager.
When Rhodes was 16, his father was convicted for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl. So his father was essentially an abuser. And this behaviour was a reflection of a misogynistic value system that he had, that women and girls were there to be used and abused, that they served a function for men. And I think that was something that would have cemented itself in Rhodes's mind.
Ben was an army veteran and a firefighter. Could hardly be a more upright member of the community. So imagine the shame that would have fallen upon him for his arrest for sexually lascivious behaviour.
I think another important thing when we look at his father's conviction is his father's response to it. So he takes his own life shortly after he's convicted of this crime. And in this case, Suicide is the ultimate act of control. It's the ultimate way of saying, I'm not going to take responsibility for my own actions. I'm going to decide to opt out of this whole thing altogether.
Was it that made the change to Rhodes's character? Was it that flicked the switch?
Rhodes was a college dropout who'd also failed in becoming a police officer. He went through numerous jobs and 2 failed marriages, never seeming to settle. By the late 1970s, though, he'd found the job that would define his murderous career.
Eventually, Rhodes finds a job that suits him down to the ground, and that's the job of a long-haul truck driver. So here he has long periods of time when he's unsupervised, he's off the grid, he doesn't have to answer to anybody, and here he gets the chance to spend long periods of time on his own, ruminating, fantasizing, and I think this is a very dangerous period in his life.
At the age of 41, Rhodes married his 3rd wife, Deborah. But his sexual perversions would eventually lead to their separation.
Their relationship, she was disillusioned when the marriage went on because Rhodes wanted to go to a swinger club here in Houston. That was something that she didn't want to do, but he kept pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope.
Rather than just accepting that and saying, okay, that's fine, he pointed to her and said, well, clearly there's a problem with you. You need to loosen up. So this is showing me that his relationships, if you'd call them that, with women, they weren't based on mutuality or respect or love or affection. They were simply a way of him getting what he wanted.
Deborah admitted subsequently how badly she'd been abused by Rhodes, the man who thought nothing of handcuffing her to the bed or raping her so badly that she feared for her life. But it's undoubtedly true that that form of sexual abuse was the signature that was to develop throughout Rhodes' crimes.
Rhodes had an uncontrollable sexual appetite. Working as a long-distance truck driver presented him with the perfect opportunity to act out his aggressive sexual perversions on strangers he would meet along the road, with or without their consent.
I think it's important to emphasise here the term consent, because there are people who will consensually engage in this kind of behaviour. But when it came to Rhodes, he didn't care whether people consented to it or not. He wanted to do this, and whether or not people were happy with that was just completely disregarded.
In February 1990, a distressed young woman flagged down passing motorists. She claimed she'd been abducted by a truck driver and kept hostage for 2 weeks.
She was subject to torture, sexual assault and rape, and she actually had a leash round her neck when she was found by passing motorists. So this was a victim of Rhodes. This was somebody who had luckily managed to escape with her life.
The police drove the young woman across Houston looking for Rhodes' truck.
And they immediately started searching for it, and they found it, but when they brought Rhodes out to the car for her to look at him, she just looked down, would not identify him, said, "That's not him."
It was an opportunity to stop Rhodes that sadly wasn't taken.
Later that day, after they let him go, she told him that that was him, but she was too afraid to identify him, even though there were 2 police officers by her side. She had been completely terrorized and traumatized during the 2-week ordeal.
Rhodes is such a terrifying man that he puts literally the fear of God into this young woman. Now that must have even further confirmed Rhodes' absolute sense of invulnerability. It must have even further inflated his already overinflated ego.
A chance to put Rhodes safely behind bars had been missed. For now, he remained free to stalk the highways. By the spring of 1990, the 44-year-old had been living as a sexual predator and a murderer for over a decade, but nobody had any idea. His veneer of lies was about to come crashing down. On the 1st of April 1990, a state trooper named Michael Miller spied a truck on Interstate 10 in Casa Grande, Arizona.
I observed a truck parked on the side of the road with his emergency lights on, but he had no triangles out. So I went up alongside of the truck, I pulled behind the truck, had my lights activated to go up and check on the driver of the truck and see what his situation was.
Armed with a flashlight, Michael took a look through the windows of the truck.
I saw some lights in the back in the sleeper berth and peered in the window of the driver's side of the truck. And I shone my flashlight in. I heard a woman started screaming. And what I saw was a woman that looked like she had a horse bit in her mouth.
Shocked to see a woman with a metal restraint strapped to her mouth, Michael was even more surprised when a man appeared out of the darkness of the cab.
The driver came sliding out of the sleeper berth and then came on down to the pavement and put his hands up against the side of the truck. And he said, "That's okay, officer, everything's fine. We are consenting adults." And I still heard screaming coming from inside the truck. And he said, "I've got a gun in my rear pocket." And I patted him down, felt it, took it out, put it in my pocket, and then handcuffed him, took him back to my patrol car. I think he was probably thinking, how am I going to get out of this one? What do I do now?
With the man seemingly restrained, Michael headed back to the truck.
And when I got back up there and looked inside, I saw a completely naked female. And I took a blanket that was there and covered her up. Told her that she was okay, that the police were taking care of it, and the driver would not bother her anymore.
But had Michael waited a minute more, the man in his car, Robert Ben Rhodes, would have been free.
Well, I went back to my patrol car, and Mr. Rhodes had gotten his handcuffs in front of him, and he was in the process of trying to get a key in his pocket to get his handcuffs off. If he'd have done that, he'd have been gone. He'd have fled the scene.
Robert Ben Rhodes was arrested and taken to Casa Grande Police Department.
Way back to bed. Invite me back. I think that's about as far as I've ever gone.
Detectives wanted to know more about the man whose home address was over 1,000 miles away in Houston, Texas, under the jurisdiction of FBI agent Bob Lee.
He had been arrested the night before, and they asked me to get some background information on Rhodes since he lived in Houston at the time.
The young girl had been through a traumatic ordeal at the hands of Rhodes.
When the victim was interviewed by the detective, she tells him that Rhodes agreed to give her a ride. She said that she fell asleep, and when she woke up, he had her chained in the sleeper compartment and was starting to take her clothes off. He had his truck modified. He had put some anchors on both sides of the sleeper where he could put handcuffs attached to a chain on her feet, and the same thing with her hands. But she also said that, I was going to see the president. It makes you wonder what her grip on reality is. And then you take that back to the allegations she's made, and is that a credible statement?
I can't tell you, this broad is not playing really full deck.
The mental state of the distressed woman meant there was a chance that Rhodes could walk free.
I think Rhodes believed he was going to get away with this because he very deliberately chose victims who were vulnerable. This particular victim had some mental health issues. She experienced delusions. But the police were very good at their jobs here, and they observed that this woman's story never changed. It was consistent, and that was what mattered.
Some of the things that helped corroborate her statement, she said that when Rhodes approached her, she was fighting trying to get away from him, and said, I bit him on his shoulder.
Hey, can you remove your shirt from me? Do I have to? I prefer not.
And he had a bite mark on his shoulder. The case didn't go to trial. Rhodes agreed to enter a guilty plea on a plea bargain and got a reduced sentence on it.
In December 1990, Rhodes was sentenced to 6 years for the kidnap and sexual assault of the young woman. While Rhodes was in custody, Bob had begun to unearth the past of the 45-year-old truck driver.
Well, the first thing I did was check our national database for his criminal history, and I found he was a suspect in a previous kidnapping. I called the Houston Police Department and spoke to a detective in the sex crimes unit and obtained his report.
The report told the story of the woman who was raped and kidnapped but refused to identify Rhodes in February 1990. Bob was now aware of 2 cases where women had slipped through the grasp of Robert Ben Rhodes. But he was certain that searching the trucker's apartment would uncover any darker secrets.
I talked to the apartment manager. After she saw in the paper that he'd been arrested, she went up to his apartment to take a look and told me that she saw women's garments all over the apartment. He also had chains and handcuffs, and there was a white towel that had a lot of blood on it. There were some racks where he could chain somebody to.
The apartment bore all the hallmarks of a sexual predator.
I found a stack of photographs. I think they were in his dresser drawer. And it showed a young girl who was in various stages of dress. He had a lot of nude pictures of her. He had pictures of her chained up. And I could tell that he had held her for a while because on some of the photographs she had some bruises, but over time the bruises were changing color. So that told me that she had been captive for at least a week or so.
So they knew that at very least he has definitely harmed other women and at worst killed them, but they didn't have any actual cases to connect this evidence to. So this was the beginning of a very long investigation.
The pictures of the young girl preyed on Bob's mind.
I tried to identify the girl. I carried a picture with me, and every time I went to a different police department, I'd show it to the officers to see if any of them recognized her. Did they have a missing person case or anything like that?
In September 1990, over 800 miles away in Bond County, Illinois, reports of the discovery of a body landed on the desk of Detective Michael Sheely.
So I went out to this rural community and met with the sheriff out there, and he had told me that a local farmer was going to donate this particular barn to the fire department to burn down. And he was making a last-minute inspection and had found what he believed to be the remains of a human body.
The badly decomposed body was found up in the hayloft, and it was clear the victim had been murdered.
It was very apparent that there had been a wire garrote made, a ligature, if you will, to place around the victim's neck. And it's our belief that she was bound and handcuffed over a large beam that raised her hands up, and it's our belief that he placed a wire around her neck, then he continued to squeeze that with this broken piece of board throughout and then strangled her to death.
And he twisted this ligature at least 16 times, according to the medical examiner. So he would not only have enjoyed torturing her, but he would have enjoyed watching her die.
A forensic anthropologist believed that the body had been in the barn for about 6 months.
The other thing he did is that he gave us gender identification, said it was the body of a young girl. He gave us an age range between 14 and 16 years old. He gave us hair color, which we thought would assist in the identification early on. What was alarming is we had approximately 950 missing female girls that fit her profile and fit the time of death. So it became overwhelming initially.
Michael sent out details of the victim to missing persons departments across the country. A detective in Pasadena, Texas, soon got back to him.
And she contacted me and she said that her victim, a runaway identified as Regina K. Walters, her family had received an anonymous telephone call after her disappearance saying that she had been left in a barn.
Regina's father receives a call on his unlisted number. So this is a number that isn't publicly available. Regina's one of the few people who actually know it. And he doesn't recognize the caller, but the caller tells him that he knows where Regina is, that she's in a barn, that he's cut her hair. And when her father asks, is she still alive, the caller hangs up.
So immediately, a lot of red flags that this really sounds like this could be our victim. And so I asked if she had dental records.
The dental records confirmed that the body belonged to Regina Walters, who was just 14 years old. Detectives could finally put a name to the face on the shocking photographs that had been found in Rhodes' apartment.
Well, the photographs to identify the young person would have been impossible for me from being out there. But the barn that she entered, I knew every square foot of that barn. I had seen that barn for days and days. And so the minute I saw the photographs of her entering the barn and going into the barn loft and the beams, it just gave you that eerie feeling that that's exactly what had happened here. And so we were on to this case.
2 photos of Regina in particular were difficult to look at.
He had chronologically photographed her. The most telling for us was how he had taken photographs and staged her death, and had staged them during the course right before he'd killed her.
And looking in her eyes and looking at her face, you can tell that she's terrified. And at that point, she's just minutes from being killed. When you see a photograph like that, you have to control your emotions. It's a piece of evidence that you're looking at. You have to realize what your goal is. Your goal is to take this piece of evidence, tie it to someone, and be able to put that person in jail.
The story of how Regina Walters ended up in the truck of Robert Ben Rhodes is a tragic one.
Regina had a boyfriend, Ricky Jones, and she and Ricky decided to run away one day. They were out on the highway hitchhiking, and Rhodes stopped his truck and picked him up and took off with her, and that's the last that she was seen.
She's just really a beautiful, young, almost just totally normal 14-year-old girl with just a little rebellion streak. Unfortunately, she made the wrong decision.
Rhodes kept Regina prisoner in the makeshift torture chamber of his truck for 2 weeks. It's widely believed that he disposed of her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky, almost immediately. He was never seen again.
She was the prize, and the boyfriend was just surplus to requirements.
While the investigation into Regina's murder continued, Rhodes remained in prison for kidnap and sexual assault. But by early 1992, he was due out on parole.
So the clock was ticking for us to make a case against Rhodes.
Detectives in Texas and Illinois had been working together to build the case against Rhodes. If they didn't charge him soon, the dangerous killer would be released. Finally, they had enough evidence.
The district attorney in Bond County, Illinois, issued an arrest warrant for Rhodes for the murder of Regina Walters just prior to him being released from prison in Arizona. And Detective Sheely flew out to the prison to serve him with the arrest warrant and to bring him back to Illinois to face the charges.
Detective Michael Sheely remembers meeting Rhodes in the Arizona prison and confronting him with the evidence linking him to Regina.
He was cold, he was calculated, He didn't have any trouble looking you square in the eye and saying he's not involved. We provided him with the arrest warrant for murder. There's still no reaction, nothing at all. And so I had a 8x10 photograph of Regina, and I put it on the table in front of him, turned it around, and I said, "This is your victim." And that was the first time any emotion out of him. But it wasn't an emotion of sorrow or an emotion of something that he had done. He was angry. And he got up and said that the interview was over. He wouldn't speak to us any longer.
At a court hearing on the 11th of September 1992, Rhodes agreed to a plea bargain. He admitted to murdering Regina Walters so he wouldn't have to face the death penalty.
The courtroom was packed, a great deal of spectators. There had been a lot of interest in this case because there was now speculation that he was a serial killer.
He didn't just plead guilty, he pled guilty with a smile. He was reveling in the trauma that he created. And for me, that shows that he was still very much the sexual sadist that he'd always been. This is somebody who hadn't changed whatsoever. And I think he enjoyed the opportunity to relive the details of these killings.
Regina Walters' family couldn't travel all the way from Texas to Illinois to be in the courtroom, but Michael Sheely made sure he conveyed their feelings to the killer.
As he was beginning to exit the courtroom, I just became overly aware, if you will, that there was no one there on behalf of Regina. And so I mentioned to him in a very small, faint voice as he began to pass me that it was certainly my pleasure that I was going to get to send him into prison for the rest of his life. And he was really upset at that comment and told me to get f***ed. And so maybe not as professional as I should have been, I returned and told him where he was going. I was hoping that that was going to happen to him. So that was my last real conversation with Robert Ben Rhodes. And looking back at it, I'm kind of glad that that's what I told him.
With Rhodes behind bars, investigations continued into possible victims of the killer. There were many missing persons who fitted his MO.
Rhodes would target his victims, generally people that either had mental deficiencies or heavy drug users that he picked up hitchhiking. He referred to them as lot lizards. These are, as he described, women that hang around truck stops to take care of the truckers or to swap sex for rides somewhere.
He is so itinerant. He literally crosses state line after state line after state line all over the United States. They aren't to know it, but when they climb into the cab of Rhodes' truck, their lives are to change forever.
In 2003, 11 years after Rhodes had been imprisoned for the murder of Regina Walters, Texas Ranger Brooks Long began investigating the disappearance of two hitchhiking newlyweds, Douglas Iskowski and Patricia Walsh, who'd been missing since January 1990.
They were both from Seattle, Washington. They had basically given up their personal belongings and were traveling to the East Coast of the United States primarily for religious reasons. The family searched extensively for them, but then the remains of Douglas were located around 1990, but there was not a formal identification of it being Douglas Iskowski till 1992 through dental records. So there wasn't much to go on. There was no witnesses. There were several suspects, but nobody was actually linked to the crime.
28-year-old Douglas's remains had been discovered in Crockett County, Texas. Brooks wanted to look at the ballistic evidence that had been found at the scene.
Mr. Ziskowski was shot multiple times in the head. He was shot with a Jennings J22 semi-automatic handgun. This information was obtained by not only the projectiles removed from his head, but also the casings that were left behind on the crime scene that were collected by law enforcement. So what was unique about the ballistic information was that the ammunition used in the murder of Mr. Ziskowski was very rare.
This Tarson-branded ammunition had a noticeable T on the casings. This fact had initially ruled Rhodes out as the potential killer.
The reason he was eliminated at that time was simply because the ammunition that was seized from Robert Ben Rhodes was marketed under the name of Arms Corps.
Brooks contacted the Casa Grande police to take a closer look at the ammunition that was found in Rhodes' truck when he was arrested for kidnap back in April 1990.
And when he called me, I asked him to open the Arms Corps box and to describe the head stamp on the casing. And he said it's a T. So that was the first clue that this is the guy, most probably is the guy, and we need to put efforts and resources into this because that all matched.
With a possible link between Rhodes and Douglas secured, Brooks gathered all the information he had on the killer and concentrated his efforts towards connecting Rhodes to Douglas's 24-year-old wife, Patricia Walsh.
She's probably out there somewhere, and they may not even know who she is because Douglas had no identification, he had no clothing, Regina K. Walters didn't have any identification, she didn't have any clothing. So when you looked at those two situations, what I started doing was looking for a red-headed female in her mid-20s that was probably naked and would have been shot with a Jennings J22 handgun with toss and ammunition.
Brooks received word of a possible unidentified body in Millard County, Utah.
So after I obtained that information, I reached out to the Millard County Sheriff's Office and inquired as to the status of that case. And what I was told by their chief deputy was, we haven't solved it, and the skeletal remains are actually inside our evidence vault. So I was able to tell him, I know who that victim is, and I also know who killed her.
Brooks was right. Dental records revealed that the remains belonged to Patricia Walsh.
Millard County had projectiles and had casings that matched. The same gun killed Douglas Ziskowski, killed Patricia Candace Walsh. So that was linked. Then the timeline on the records, we were able to determine that Rhodes was traveling westbound. So what made sense is he eliminated Douglas Ziskowski first.
Douglas was essentially just a barrier because Patricia was what Rhodes wanted. So he killed Douglas, he dumped his body very quickly, but he kept Patricia alive for 7 days, and he tortured her and he raped her before he eventually killed her and disposed of her body.
In 2003, 13 years after her remains had been found in Utah, Patricia Walsh had been identified, another innocent victim of Robert Ben Rhodes.
Patricia must have been absolutely terrified during the days that she spent with Rhodes. And I think during this time, she probably tried to placate him, she probably tried to plead with him and interact with him. But there would be absolutely no reaction to that from Rhodes because this guy was essentially a killing machine. He wasn't affected by other people's trauma or emotion. He got off on people's fear. And I think the more afraid that Patricia was, the more he enjoyed it.
Investigators still needed to find some hard evidence that linked Rhodes to the newlywed hitchhikers before they could prosecute him with their murders.
So now became an analysis and comparison not only for DNA under Douglas Ziskowski, now there was analysis to be done and comparisons relating to Patricia Candace Walsh. And what had happened on that is eventually there was a match that was located on a white towel that was seized from Robert Ben Rhodes' truck that was matched to the DNA of Patricia Candace Walsh. So there was an affirmative link. The MO, the timeline, these things fit. And Rhodes was in custody. He was in jail in the state of Illinois.
By March 2012, Rhodes had served 20 years for the murder of Regina Walters, but he was due to be released. Now investigators needed to convince a grand jury that he was guilty of 2 more slayings before Rhodes was freed. Once again, the clock was ticking. Texas Ranger Brooks Long needed a jury to indict Rhodes based on the new facts he'd uncovered.
The Crockett County grand jury returned 2 indictments for capital murder on Robert Ben Rhodes for the murder of Douglas Scott Ziskowski and Patricia Candace Walsh, based on the evidence and the information that was presented. So essentially, he was extradited and detained in the state of Texas. And as we were preparing for trial, he pled guilty to both cases and received multiple life sentences.
The killings of Douglas and Patricia took the number of Rhodes' known victims to at least 3. After working as a truck driver for over a decade, he'd honed his method of murder.
I think that Robert Ben Rhodes preyed on people that I think we coined the term later as disposable. He looked at people that had some checkered history, people that he believed wouldn't immediately be missed. And so I think he systematically profiled his victim, if you will. And I think he was very good at it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those folks out there. And Rhodes knew that. He had an endless supply of people that he could prey on, and he did.
As far as Rhodes is concerned, any woman hitchhiking or working in a truck stop is fair game. And after all, who's going to miss them? It is a perfect combination. If you were to devise a fictional serial killer, Rhodes would be a very, very good example.
Brooks Long continued his search for victims of Rhodes. There was one obvious person to start with: Ricky Jones, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Regina Walters.
After the work had been done to identify who the killer was relating to Douglas Ziskowski and Patricia Walsh, then there was resources put into myself in trying to locate Ricky Lee Jones. Because as I reviewed the file and reached out to officers and witnesses in that case, it was obvious that he had never been located. His remains had never been found.
Ricky had been missing since early 1990. Evidence found in Rhodes' truck when he was arrested in Arizona just weeks after that suggested that he could be the killer.
During the course of the search that was done by the FBI, there was a notebook that was found, a very, very alarming notebook where Rhodes had kept information. In that information, in that notebook, was phone numbers and family names. There was even a notation with a drawing of a knife with appeared to be like blood drops, and it said, "Ricky's dead. Ricky Jones is dead."
Brooks sent out information to police departments. He was desperate to locate Ricky.
We didn't get anything back from these agencies. But as I, on my own, started searching unsolved homicides and looking at various databases online, I essentially came across a young white male's remains that were found in Mississippi. I then reached out to law enforcement, and it was unfortunate because we were able to obtain some teeth from the remains in Mississippi, and we were able to obtain samples, biological samples from Ricky Lee Jones' biological mother, and those were compared and they were matched. So we knew that we'd located Ricky Lee Jones. The bad part about that was that the remains could not all be located. So Robert Ben Rhodes has never stood trial for the abduction and murder of Ricky Lee Jones, simply because there was a lack of evidence.
Despite not being able to link Rhodes to the crime, it is widely believed that he did kill the 18-year-old before murdering Ricky's girlfriend, Regina Walters. Investigators believe Rhodes is responsible for the deaths of many more innocent people.
This is a case that is unresolved. It's a case that's incomplete. There are going to be many, many families across America missing relatives who've been murdered by this individual, and they deserve justice.
I think during the course of the investigation, initially, we believed that it was probably in the neighborhood of probably 10 to 15. But as the investigation grew and the FBI spent a lot of time with it, the behavioral science unit spent a great deal of time and effort, And they had actually linked him up to approximately 45 homicides throughout the United States that not only fit his profile, but fit his timeline as well as a truck driver.
I don't think there's any doubt that there's other victims and there's other crimes that can be linked to Robert Ben Rhodes. I think that science and the ability to link potential suspects through DNA are somewhat limited in this case because of his MO and what he would do with those victims. But as other agencies become aware of Robert Ben Rhodes, hopefully some of this information will get back to the right investigator or officer or even family member that might be able to listen and say, hey, why don't you look at this guy?
Whatever the true number of victims, there could have been many more had it not been for a chance encounter on the side of the I-10 in Casa Grande, Arizona in April 1990.
The most striking moment in the case is that wonderful Arizona Highway Patrol officer coming upon this rig with its hazard lights flashing, climbing up, looking through the window, and seeing a young woman trapped in the car who starts screaming. That was the moment in which finally Rhodes's extraordinary run of killing came to an end.
And had that officer not gone to check on that truck, he could well be killing people right now.
I had a phone call from her many years ago. She thanked me for saving her life. I said, well, hey, you're just doing my job. You enjoy your life and have a good one. I'm glad you have a life to have.
Robert Ben Rhodes remains safely behind bars at the Minard Correctional Center in Illinois. He will never be released from prison.
I think that Robert Ben Rhodes is probably the most evil person I've ever met in my life. And I've met a lot of evil people.
I hesitate and always have hesitated to use the word monster, but Rhodes certainly deserves to be called a monster.
And I dealt with many murderers, but of all of those, the one that stands out as far as the lack of emotion, the lack of remorse, he wins the prize by far. There is no feeling to this man. There is no inkling of remorse. There's no inkling of anything. The only regret he has is that he got caught.
Robert Ben Rhodes is a cold-blooded sexual predator who preyed upon vulnerable women for his own self-gratification. He would chain his victims in his truck and torture them before disposing of their lifeless bodies in the most callous manner. Only Rhodes knows exactly how many people he has killed, and his reluctance to give closure to the loved ones of his victims undoubtedly makes him one of the world's most evil killers. November 1974, Wichita, Kansas. The city was gripped by fear as a serial killer was attacking people in their own homes before binding, torturing, and ultimately killing them in pursuit of the thrill.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again.
The man behind these gruesome killings was living amongst his victims in the very town he was terrorizing.
He is a man who, for all intents and purposes, was upright citizen, and yet, while he was that on the surface, underneath there is no question at all, he was a monster.
His evil is a different evil, mainly because he thinks that he's entitled to it.
His name was Dennis Rader, but he would go on to create a murderous alter ego for himself, a brand of his own.
Rader would stalk his victims. He would attack them in their homes. He would torture them and kill them.
Rader's preferred method of murder, to bind, torture, and then kill, became his name, BTK. It took over 30 years for authorities to bring him to justice.
Wichita didn't have a boogeyman, they had BTK.
His gruesome crimes make Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers. January 1974, Wichita, Kansas. One of the world's most notorious serial killers began a reign of terror that would last over 3 decades.
I think the thing that makes Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers is the sheer conceit and arrogance that runs through every vein of his body.
The Otero family had just moved into the area where Dennis Rader lived. They became his first victims. He killed 2 children and their parents, leaving their other children to discover his crimes.
Dennis Rader's first murder, he's chosen to kill 4 people. That is quite a significant undertaking. And I think that really is testament to his arrogance and his hubris, that he thought he could do this.
A pillar of the community, involved in the church and a scout leader, Rader would go on to kill another 6 times, with his last murder taking place in 1991 when he attacked Dolores E. Davis in her home.
He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her. This time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away.
But this killer's ego and new technology meant that he was finally in the sights of police and the FBI after he wrote to local newspapers and a TV station to brag about the murders he'd got away with.
If he'd have just sat there and kept his mouth shut, I'm not sure we'd ever caught him. And so, you know, that kind of arrogance and complacency came back to bite him pretty hard.
Rader liked to torture people, and that wasn't just his murder victims, it was the families of his murder victims. So when he has the opportunity to relive and to retell the stories of the horrendous acts that he's perpetrated, he really does seize on that. He enjoys revealing all of the explicit and the gory details.
For the decades he remained uncaught, Wichita, the largest city in the Sunflower State of Kansas, lived in terror of the killer who'd named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill.
With killers like Rader, there is always knock-on effects. And someone who is killing in such a way over a period of time is going to damage the community. There is going to be fear. There's going to be looking out of the curtains at the neighbours. It just breeds an appropriate paranoia amongst people. When's it going to happen next? Who's it going to be next?
When he was finally arrested in 2005, his reign of terror came to an end. But even then, he revelled in the attention.
Rader confessed he didn't deny having committed these murders, and actually I think he quite enjoyed having that notoriety. Finally, people knew who BTK was.
This killer's story begins in 1945. He was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas on March the 9th, the eldest of 4 boys born to William and Dorothea Rader.
Rader was born in 1945, and he was one of several children within a very traditional nuclear family. His father was strict, but not particularly abusive, and many children grew up in households like this.
He was upright, he was a scout, he was on all sorts of programs for good children. He had the ability to blend in. He wasn't bullied, for example, as a lot of killers are.
To his friends and family, he was a model child, but in private, Rader began to show his true colours.
Rader claims that when he was a youngster, he abused animals, so he hung a cat and he hung a dog. We do see, in quite a few cases of serial killers, animal harm in the background.
As he went into puberty, he described himself as looking at girly mags, developing a fascination with underwear, and then, significantly, and indeed deeply significant in his later crimes,
was a fascination with bondage and sadomasochism.
Having graduated from a local high school in Wichita, in 1965, Rader enrolled in Kansas Wesleyan College in Salina, 90 miles from home. However, he dropped out.
In 1966, when Rader was 21, he joined the United States Air Force and remained in it for 4 years. He worked on systems. He was that kind of man. Systems are very much his kind of thing. He served abroad, sometimes in Europe. As far as we know, not a particularly distinguished career, but not a bad one. He returns to Wichita, Kansas, and marries a girl he was at school with.
Rader marries and has 2 children, and from the outside they do very much look like the respectable cereal box family, just like any other regular American family.
In 1974, Rader suddenly and inexplicably changed from the respected ex-forces gentleman to a brutal evil killer.
There has to be something that set him off, because that first explosion of violence was so shocking, so dramatic, so utterly horrifying that you couldn't possibly have imagined it was like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
A new family to the neighborhood became his first victims.
The Otero family had recently moved to Wichita because they wanted a new start. This was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But unfortunately, this was to be very short-lived, because one day the teenage children arrive home to the most horrendous scene.
On January the 15th, 1974, Wichita police were called to the scene. Detective Tim Ralph was one of the task force investigators on the BTK case in later years.
At the Otero house, they were actually called by the children. The 3 older children had come home, and they had found their mother and father. They called, and the first responders, or the first people that arrived at that time, they went to the bedroom, they found the father and the mother.
The scene they discovered was horrendous. Dennis Rader had broken into the family home and murdered everyone in the house in a way that would become his trademark.
He ties up husband and wife with a Venetian blind cord, suffocates them.
The older children didn't want their younger siblings to come home and find this because they thought they were at school. And so the officers went to their elementary schools in the area and found that both of the younger siblings had not made it to school that day.
When officers searched the house, it soon became clear that the parents weren't the only victims. 9-year-old Joseph and his sister Josephine, 11, were both found murdered.
Their 11-year-old daughter is found hanging in the basement, whether he killed her by hanging her or strangled her and then strung up the body. We have a situation where he's created elaborate knotwork and hung the body up. It's almost like some sort of macabre art display.
Rader appeared to have fixated on the younger daughter, Josephine, because he seems to have spent the most time with her body. She was the prize, and the others were just obstacles that he had to get out of the way.
He kills the boy, ties him up, leaves on the floor of his bedroom, again suffocated.
Rader had killed 4 members of the Otero family: 38-year-old Joseph, 33-year-old Julie, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine.
The Otero case provided an overall mindset of this person, that he certainly was into some kind of binding fantasy.
The way Rader had killed the family showed the beginnings of what would become his modus operandi.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again. So literally holding them on the edge of life and death, watching the life drain out of them and then giving it back. So having that power over somebody's survival or somebody's demise is something that this killer very much enjoyed.
This was not, sadly, the act of a madman. It was the first of a series of killings in Wichita that would come to terrify the town.
With few clues as to what had happened or why, the Wichita police were baffled. Just a few months later, in April 1974, Rader struck again.
Rader starts escalating in the classic profile system. Catherine Bright, who's 21 years old, good looking, he forces his way into the house with a gun. Catherine and her brother Kevin return at lunchtime to their house.
And he forces Kevin to tie Catherine to a chair and begins to struggle with Kevin. Kevin is fighting back, and Rader really doesn't like this, so he shoots Kevin in the head. Now, miraculously, Kevin survives and he's able to flee and summon help, but unfortunately, it's too late for his sister Catherine.
I think he tried to bind her up, but it just wasn't working, and the whole thing just came unraveled, and he would take out a knife and he would very viciously stab her several times. And then he left thinking that he had killed her, and I don't think he realized that Kevin had run out. And Kevin got a hold of a neighbor who called the police. When the first officers got there, Catherine was still alive, but she was barely breathing, and she couldn't identify her attacker, and she was taken to the hospital, and she died in surgery just a couple hours after that.
She's bound, she's tortured, and she's eventually killed.
Catherine's brother, Kevin, was the first person to give clues as to Rader's identity to police.
He describes a white male, 180 pounds. We were looking for a single person. You were looking for this white male in his late 20s.
Could cover a description of quite a lot of men in Wichita, Kansas. But at least it's something. Rader once again slips behind the mask, returns to being a pillar of the community. The police are left struggling.
With no substantial leads and a brutal killer still at large, it was only a matter of time before Dennis Rader struck again.
In January, they have the Otero killings. In April, they have Catherine's killing and Kevin's attack. They have no idea what they have on their hands. I don't imagine they get an awful lot of these kinds of attacks in Wichita.
By the end of the year, the police thought they'd had a breakthrough in their investigation of the killings.
In October 1974, and the police arrest 3 men on the suspicion of the Otero killings. Rader is furious. This is an outrage. Those were my killings. Nobody else. It's not absolutely not acceptable. You can almost hear him saying it to himself. This is not right.
Incensed that his murders were being attributed to someone else, Rader wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and hid it inside a textbook at the Wichita Public Library. He then phoned the Otero murder hotline to describe where the letter could be found.
In his letter, claiming credit for the Otero killings, it's not quite well written. It's clumsy, misspelt, bad grammar, but the overall motive is absolutely clear.
Rader attempted to justify the killings with the phrase, "I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being torture and being mine." Understanding the fear he was causing, Raider went one step further and gave his murderous alter ego a name.
He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity. He didn't just want to be a nameless killer. So he didn't want to get caught, and he also wanted recognition for his crimes. So he had to come up with a moniker: bind, torture, kill.
Dennis Rader was to be known as BTK, and as he communicated with the press, Rader made a chilling threat that he was to strike again.
He'd gone to work for a security company, installing home security kits. Well, you can imagine what the residents of Wichita were doing at this moment. Suddenly, there's a serial killer on the loose. What are they going to be doing?
They bought elaborate security systems and burglar alarms, which actually turned out to be quite ironic because the killer who was targeting the victims had actually worked for a security company. So the very person who should have been invested in keeping people safe was the one who we had to watch out for.
It would, however, be nearly 3 years before Rader killed again.
In 1977, Rader murders Shirley Vayan. Now, she's a 26-year-old mother of 3. Rader follows home Shirley's 5-year-old son.
Once again, he forces his way into her house.
He locks the children in the bathroom and he proceeds to torture and kill Shirley.
Your children are screaming in the bathroom. The only thing you must be grateful for in imagining this horrifying scene is they couldn't actually see what was happening to their mother.
Once again, Rader used strangulation to claim his victim. It was becoming increasingly clear that Rader had an obsession with tying ropes as part of his murderous action.
This is so far outside normal experience. The body seems to be almost secondary to displaying his skill at tying knots.
Yet again, Rader disappears the scene as if a ghost. There's no clear forensic evidence. It's a random killing.
Later that year, on December the 8th, 1977, with the police still having no clue about his identity, Rader would strike again.
After the murder of Shirley Vayan, Rader kills Nancy Fox. She's a 25-year-old secretary, and he'd likely stalked her for some time. He's getting better at his offending at this point in time.
He's looking at the house. He cuts the phone lines outside. He waits for her inside the house. He waits until she gets home. She is, if you like, the archetypal BTK victim.
He broke into her house, completely invading her privacy. He tied her up, he strangled her with a belt, he masturbated at the scene. But that wasn't all. He actually called the police. So there is a tape of Dennis Rader's voice. So they have the voice of the offender.
Yes, you will find a homicide South Pershing, Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? South Pershing. That is correct.
This is Rader celebrating once again his own power. Here he is, swaggering. There can be no other word for it. That he knows something that nobody else knows, and he's taken another life.
Within 4 years, Rader had murdered 7 people, and yet the police had nothing to go on bar odd clues and a crackly voice recording. He had continued to evade capture and baffle the police, but he wanted more.
Rader sees all of the attention that serial killers like Ted Bundy are getting, and I think he wants a slice of that action. But he wants to be more than Ted Bundy, more than the other serial killers. And I think that's very much what drives his offending and the form that that takes.
A month after Nancy's death, Rader sends a note to the local television station in which he explains that he can close her eyes so that she can pass away. I mean, it's an act of the most extraordinary vanity. And again refers in the note to the television station to, "I'll be doing it again."
Those 7 murders back in 1978 became directly attributed to BTK, and he had made several communications. He'd sent them through the local paper at the time, so those 7 were always attributed to him.
Local police detective Randy Stone noticed that Rader was enjoying the attention that he was getting.
He liked watching himself on TV, so communicating with the news media was part of his way of achieving the notoriety and being publicized and everything. And he enjoyed watching himself on TV, and he favored the news media that had the best signal reception on his television.
I think one of the things that sustains Rader's appetite for publicity is that he knows full well that he's not just terrifying individual victims, he's terrifying the whole town. They are in absolute fear. The sales of his security systems are going up rapidly. It's quite clear that there is a serial killer at work. It's quite clear that all the victims are in Wichita, which is not a huge town. And it's quite clear the police have no suspects.
The community were particularly terrified by these murders because the police had to tell the community that there was a serial killer on the loose. They had to do this in order for people to take steps to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. The quiet and the peacefulness of 1970s suburbia really has been completely shaken by these murders.
After scores of officers investigating and thousands of man-hours, the police realized they had nothing to stop this killer. But then BTK seemed to have stopped himself. Years went by without any further sign from him. The case went cold. Could Dennis Rader have got away with it?
He disappears again, and indeed pretty much disappears completely. 2 years pass, 3.
Rader goes dormant for a period of time. Whether there are murders that aren't linked to him or not is a matter of speculation.
As the years went by without another attack from BTK, Wichita police called in the FBI.
The local police form a task force, which ironically they nicknamed Ghostbusters, to try and find whoever the killer is. They are singularly unsuccessful. They do not get anywhere near Rader.
The Ghostbusters team would keep investigating BTK for the next 3 years.
There was a theory that he was either in jail or dead or had left the area. That theory was the basis for Ghostbusters, was the basis for searching for men that had left the area after 1979.
Over 600 suspects were tracked by the task force, but none of them could be connected with the BTK murders. Questions and rumors began to swirl about BTK's fate, and with no more murders in the Wichita area, some considered the horror over.
So it isn't until 1985 that he kills again. But this time, he moves his victimology. Instead of a young woman, it's an older woman, 53, called Marine. In fact, she lives very close to Rader. Okay, he hasn't actually killed anybody for years. Can you imagine what must be building up inside that tortured mind?
With Marine Hedge, Rader is changing his modus operandi. Not only does he murder her, he then takes the body, of all places, to a church where he poses her in degrading positions and takes photographs and ultimately dumps the body. This is the use of a human being as an object, as a plaything.
BTK was back, still evading capture and growing in brazen confidence.
Rader dumps Nancy's body about 7 miles away in a ditch. Clearly takes some trophies, as is wont, and shows no regard for his victim whatever.
That case was not initially connected to BTK, mainly because it was a completely different part of town. It was a few miles outside of Wichita, and now it's, almost bordering Wichita, but at that time in a little city called Park City.
A year later, on the 16th of September 1986, Rader murdered 28-year-old Vicky Wegerle while she was at home with her 2-year-old son.
Rader spots a attractive 28-year-old mother called Vicky walking towards her house. We're not exactly sure how Rader got access to her, but what we do know is he did exactly what he's done before. Her husband is driving home for lunch. Their 2-year-old son is left in the house with the body of his dead mother. Her husband discovers the 2-year-old sitting on the floor on his own and goes into another room to discover his wife's body.
This time, BTK was not a suspect. Police initially believed this was a domestic homicide, and Vicky's husband was questioned. Judge Kevin O'Connor, who was Deputy District Attorney at the time, recalls the case.
Mr. Wegerle, her husband, was always considered to be a suspect. So at the time I became involved was when the DNA could be replicated, and so they had the ability to replicate the DNA so you would have enough to be able to test it without using up your full sample.
By the late 80s, police were beginning to have new technology to work with, and homicide cases like this were the first places it was being used.
We started to learn about things like DNA, and there was so much more, even video, and the computers came along, and the ability to track people through all those different mediums became something that we had to kind of look back and see if we could use some of that new technology for some of the old evidence.
The DNA from the scene soon proved the husband was innocent, and the Wegerle murder went unsolved. BTK had got away with murder again.
Rader disappears. No contact with the police, no contact with the local television station or the local newspapers. He sinks back into the facade that he's been presenting for so very long of being an upright citizen, married father of 2. Indeed, he doesn't kill again for 5 years.
Rader's final known murder occurred on the 19th of January 1991. The victim, 62-year-old Dolores E. Davis.
Dolores doesn't entirely fit the picture with what he's been doing before.
She's older, quite a lot older. He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her. This time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away. So the police find it difficult to fit a pattern here. This lady, Dolores, is again naked, dumped, but it's not anywhere near the house.
The scenes were different. He removed them from the house. He had to kind of move his victim. His ideal victim had to move to where he could control them more, and that meant a little bit more mature victim.
Police still had nothing that could help them identify the killer.
This time, Rader returns to the body and takes Polaroid pictures of the victim, all the while wearing a feminine mask. Yet again, the police are confused. Rader disappears again off the radar.
BTK had now murdered 10 people. He continued to roam the streets of Wichita, a free man for over a decade. But then in 2004, the 30th anniversary of his first murders ignites his ego once again.
A local is going to write a book called Nightmare in Wichita. If ever there was anything that was going to provoke Rader's vanity, it was going to be that somebody else was going to tell his story. No, if anyone's going to tell my story, it's going to be me.
Wichita, Kansas, 2004. The residents of this heartland U.S. town knew Dennis Rader as a church-going family man. But for decades, he was getting away with murder, binding, torturing, and killing his victims to build his own sick alter ego, BTK. It had been 30 years since his first murders.
The anniversary of the killing of the Otero family One of the newspaper reporters did a story to say, here's the anniversary story. It's another year and it hadn't been solved. And evidently BTK read that story and read in the story that there was a book being written about it. Kind of had the opinion that who's more qualified to write the book than him.
At this point, Rader resumes writing to the media. He wants to be back in the spotlight. He wants to be in control of the story. It's very, very important to him that he has credit for these crimes that he committed. He doesn't want anybody else taking away from that.
Rader wrote to the paper under his usual pseudonym, Bill Thomas Kilman, initials BTK, and included a copy of Vicky Wegerle's driving license and photos from the murder scene. This was the start of a trail of clues connecting Rader to all of his victims.
First of all, he leaves little items that he's taken from the scenes in unlikely places. He starts taunting the police, literally, saying, well, of course, you think you may know, but actually I know, and what's more, I can prove it. Here's some examples.
BTK had returned to tease the police, and they knew that this time they had to catch him. One of his communications allowed investigators to make a breakthrough.
He had left a cereal box at Home Depot here in Wichita.
He thought it was funny that to use cereal boxes because he's a serial killer.
Law enforcement went out to Home Depot and started doing some interviews. And one of the employees there said, yeah, he found something in the bed of his pickup truck, but he threw it out.
He took it home, opened it up, there was a doll, there was some other stuff in there, and he thought it was just some joke or prank, so he threw it away.
He didn't take the garbage down to the end of the driveway, and law enforcement was able to recover that package. And during the course of the investigation, Home Depot was able to provide us with a video of the parking lot. And so we were able to see a vehicle come in, and that vehicle could be identified as a Jeep Cherokee or a similar type vehicle. That was important to us because that was information at that time that law enforcement knew, but he didn't know law enforcement knew.
The police finally had sight of BTK, but with grainy, unclear CCTV footage, it was the smallest of clues. In an effort to keep himself hidden, BTK's communication methods were becoming increasingly complicated.
The police and he start communicating through small ads in the Wichita Eagle. Finally, he asks the police in one of the communications, what if I were to give you a floppy disk with more details of the killings? Could you identify me?
He asked us, be honest, because the police can't lie. Well, we can lie if we're catching a serial killer. And then he was told, you can send us whatever you want. We won't trace it.
BTK sent a disc to the local TV station. The police took a look, and suddenly, with this one mistake, the case was blown wide open.
We were contacted by KSAS Fox TV, and they had received a package. They didn't initially recognize it as being from him, but then when they opened it up and saw the contents, which included the floppy disk, they called the police department. They called me and said, hey, we got a floppy disk.
And I remember, and will never forget, being present when the disk was put into the computer, and Randy Stone, the computer expert, went through the language on the disk, which is beyond me.
At the time, I'm sitting in a little cubicle, facing the laptop, doing a thing, and I look behind me, and there's like 20 people all crowded around a semicircle around me. So it's one of those no pressure, don't screw this up type of things. So I imaged it, and I opened up the image and started looking through it, and there's the file on there, testa.rtf, which was a Microsoft Office, or it's a Word document file.
And then you see Dennis, and then more gibberish, and you see Christ Lutheran Church. When you saw that, there was another detective sitting next to Randy, who then Googled the Christ Lutheran Church, and there up in the corner of their website was a picture of the president of the church, Dennis. I still get goosebumps remembering that, because you're looking at that and going, that's him.
Finally, the team had a suspect. Now they had to prove Dennis Rader was BTK.
So then we were off and running. We learned that Rader had an address in Park City, and we went down the street that Rader was said to have lived on. You remember that little vehicle that was in the Home Depot parking lot? It was in Rader's driveway. At that point is when you knew, you didn't know how this was going to end, but you knew we'd caught him. And I made a phone call I didn't think I'd ever be able to make, but I called Kenny and I said, we got him.
But police still didn't have enough to make an arrest. They needed hard proof that Dennis Rader was the BTK killer.
They have got no probable cause to demand a DNA sample from Rader, so they take the unlikely step of going to the hospital asking for a cervical smear that his daughter had given and comparing the DNA that they got from various crime scenes, the semen they'd found. And they find that it's extremely close. The match is in cream. Must be a family member.
The police could finally move in.
A large contingent of people were sent toward Park City on February the 25th of 2005. And at 12:15, he was taken into custody.
Rader is finally arrested and is eventually charged with 10 murders, including the Oteros.
The police had many crimes they suspected Rader and his alter ego BTK of committing. But at that time, only he knew the full extent of the truth. The interrogation was a delicate affair.
We had broken up the case into several different sections, so we started to rotate in investigators, and he would be more than a year and talked for almost 34 hours. And he almost saw himself as an instructor of, as he called it, the golden age of serial killing.
When they're done with the interviews, I'm back from doing my search warrants. He's in the interview room, and they put the vest on him, and they're hooking him up with the shackles and belly chain and that kind of thing. And I just kind of stuck my head in the door and said, it's nice to be able to put a face go along with the name that I found on the floppy disk. And he looks up, and he's kind of got the shackles like that, and looks up, so you're the one, huh? And I said, yeah, I'm the one. So we kind of joked back and forth. And he was in a good mood. He was joking, and he said, oh, if I ever get out of here, I'm gonna have to find you and stuff your mouth full of a case of floppy disks.
Finally, the infamous BTK was off the streets and in custody.
So we took him over to the jail. Everybody in the holding cells and area in there knew that it happened. The cells in there are all glassed off, and so all the inmates in there, they all come up to the glass, and they're looking at the glass, and then they start pounding on the glass, chanting his name, pounding on the glass, going, BTK, BTK. And then he's got a big old smile, and he's got his hands there, he goes, 2 thumbs up, as he's 2 thumbs up to everybody chanting his name. So, I mean, he just loved that.
On the 1st of March 2005, Dennis Rader had been charged with the murders of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerly, and Dolores E. Davis.
When he first is charged and formally brought before a judge, he refuses to say anything, to plead. So the judge pleads not guilty for him. Rader says nothing. That was in March 2005. In June 2005, he's finally brought to trial. But before the trial properly begins, Rader changes his plea.
So he did not necessarily want to have a hearing. He pled guilty to the murders, and he tried to avoid any type of hearing whatsoever. The district attorney thought that it was very important that the community knows what happened. And the best way to do that is to have a public hearing. Because once it's a public hearing, then it's open.
Now, the monster is really out of the bottle, because Rader is perfectly prepared to accept that he's got away with it for 30 years and that he's going to go down in history as BTK. And what's more, he's going to make sure the world knows just how evil he was.
During the hearing, Rader described the murders, showing little remorse and with no apology, to the horror of viewers.
Most of these sentencing hearings take a couple of hours. This one took 3 days, and they would present evidence from the murders, and really just kind of combined, this is what we had at the crime scene, this is what his confession says. And it was just to kind of confirm to the community, this is really him, this is what happened.
And then you had an opportunity for the victims and their families to make a statement, and it was just truly heartbreaking and painful. But hopefully it helped them that finally, after all these years, the person that had murdered their loved one was done, was going to prison.
Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum term of 175 years. He remains in solitary confinement, where he will stay for the rest of his life.
One of my favorite shots is him being led into the penitentiary over in El Dorado, Kansas.
There is something about Rader that genuinely chills the soul. And something about that look in his eyes. I can never, ever get it out of my mind. That little smirk, that little glimmer of, I'm better than you. I really am God. I'm not only the devil, I am God as well.
Dennis Rader crafted a depraved alter ego that terrified a whole generation. But it was his own arrogance that would eventually be his undoing. For over 30 years, he was one of the world's most elusive criminals, taunting the police and teasing the press. He brutally murdered 10 people, including 2 children, by binding, torturing, and killing them, all to fit his sick brand, BTK, and make him one of the world's most evil killers. On December the 8th, 1982, Polish farmer Paweł Tuklin snuck up on a 24-year-old woman walking home alone. He pulled out a hammer and hit her in the back of the head, again and again.
Well, he would attack his victims quite savagely with a hammer, and sometimes he'd completely obliterate their face.
Tuklin dragged the semi-conscious woman behind a wall so he could hide his devious actions.
The residents heard the voice of a girl, some moans coming from the bushes.
The woman's cries for help went unheeded, and she died from the blows. In all, Tuklin sexually assaulted and battered 9 women to death with a hammer, and he seriously injured 11 more. The police called him the Scorpion.
At
the end, the prosecutor asked him what he would do if he was released. And Paweł replied, "Well, I'd probably go for another hunt."
Tuklin's reign of terror across Poland would span 8 years until he was caught in 1983. He then confessed to 9 brutal murders and to the attempted murder and sexual assault of 11 more women, making Paweł Tuklin one of the world's most evil killers. Gdansk in the north of Poland. Between 1975 and 1983, serial killer Paweł Tuklin, armed with a hammer, viciously attacked 20 women in and around the busy port city. 9 of the women were callously killed. All were sexually assaulted in what were harrowing times for the people of Gdansk.
It would have been really terrifying being a woman in this area of Poland at this particular point in time. There've been all these hammer attacks on women, 9 were killed, and this is going on for years, and all the time women have still got to go out to work, shop for groceries, they've still got to be in and around public spaces where they might be at risk.
Investigative journalist Krzysztof Wojcik followed the case.
When all this happened, there was a psychosis of fear here on the coast. Women were afraid of going out in the evenings. If they had to go out, or when they finished working in the evening, men were asked to join them, to protect them.
Making matters worse, these were politically troubled times in Poland. A revolution was brewing, and for the government and their communist police force or militia, catching a killer was a low priority. Andrzej Gawrysz was a detective with the unit in Gdansk that eventually caught Tuklin.
This was not the greatest time in the history of Poland. The authorities weren't too bothered to reveal that a criminal was prowling in our area.
The preoccupation with political dissidents allowed Tuklin free rein for 8 years. In that time, he sexually assaulted and murdered 9 women and attacked another 11 who survived.
I think Tuklin got used to getting away with it. There was something in him. He was a loner, he was an ordinary man who seemed to be able to get away with attacking women almost at will because he was quite careful. He chose isolated spots, rural communities, where there was no one to see him.
This killer's story begins some 70 years ago. Paweł Tuklin was born on the 28th of April 1946 in the village of Góra, some 40 miles from Gdansk. There were 11 children in the family. Paweł Tuklin was the 8th.
Tuklin is born in a rural community in Poland, fairly isolated. The parents, Bernard and Monica, are farmers, and it's a fairly disciplined household. The father is violent, often drunk.
As a child, Tuklin would wet the bed.
There were times when his father beat him for wetting the bed. This problem was never taken care of.
Violence filled Tuklin's childhood.
His parents were farmers. There was quite a lot of violence in the household. Violence was part and parcel of everyday life. Growing up, he's learning that violence is a way of getting things done, that controlling people, that having authority over them is achieved through being physically harmful towards them.
Tuklin's bedwetting continued into his teens with devastating consequences.
Paweł wet himself. It led to the problems with making connections with his peers. The kids at school called him a stinker, a firefighter, or a pisser. He was an object of ridicule in the classroom. He wet himself up until he was 18 years old. He was not accepted by his peers, not to mention the girls.
He smells quite strongly of urine. The other kids aren't going to want to hang around with him. They're going to make fun of him. So everywhere he goes, he's isolated, and he's somebody who is increasingly going towards the margins.
Tuklin had problems forming relationships with women.
He was intimidated by them, probably from a very early age. He found women too frightening to really interconnect with.
As a teen, Tuklin became a voyeur.
He starts engaging in a behaviour known as scoptophilia, or voyeurism. So he gets pleasure, he gets sexual gratification from watching women through their windows, and this makes him feel quite powerful.
Aged 18, Tuklin moved from his village to the suburbs of Gdansk and got a job working in construction.
He wants to start afresh in a city where nobody knows him. And he seems to achieve this for at least a short period of time. So he meets a woman, they get married, they have a baby.
It was quickly apparent to his wife, and then probably pretty apparent to him, that this wasn't going to work. The marriage was going to collapse. Indeed it did. It ended in divorce in 1973.
After the separation from his wife, Tuklin retreated into his own world, one filled with deviant fantasies that would soon turn deadly.
Tuklin's sexual madness evolved gradually. Then exhibitionism was added. Tuklin wandered around Gdansk, and he just exposed himself in front of girls. He often wore a coat and would get his penis out and flash.
wyciągał z rozporka penisa i pokazywał.
One of the first times that Tuklin is known to have exposed himself in public was near to the city's medical academy.
He would undress, unzip his jacket. One student saw his penis and, "Hey dude, you have nothing to show," and she started to laugh. In this moment, Tuklin got pissed off. For sure it upset him. That was a moment when he thought, "Bloody women, I will show you."
Pomyślał, no cholerne baby, ja wam pokażę.
He's got these urges, he wants to fulfill them, and the only way that he's going to do that is going to be through force.
Tuklin decided that to satisfy his urges and avoid rejection, he would have to subdue his next target. He used a hammer and a method he learned as a child on the farm.
Po prostu uderzał kobiety.
He hit the women so they wouldn't move.
Ogłuszał je tak jak to
He stunned them, just as he learnt to do when he lived in the country, when his father stunned the pigs before he killed them.
Tuklin's first known physical attack came when he was 29 years old. On the 31st of October 1975, Tuklin spotted 21-year-old Danusha. The waitress was on her way home after work. An investigator who played a key role in the killer's capture, Stanislav Świek, vividly recalls the assault by Tuklin that night.
He attacks this girl, smashes her with a hammer, and drags her to the bushes. Suddenly, a witness comes along, a woman. She hears the girl whimpering.
He tried to undress her, but he was scared away by the couple that was passing by.
So, he says to the woman, "I think someone's groaning over there. Something bad must have happened. You stay here, and I'll go call the ambulance." He then calmly walks away.
The woman fortunately survived.
Danusha was really lucky that she was found so quickly. It was the decisive factor for her.
Głównie zaważyło na tym, że przeżyła, bo przyjechali.
The police and ambulance came and they took her to the hospital. She was in critical condition. They managed to save her life.
Dziewczynę udało się uratować.
It was only because Tuklin did not stay with her.
Z nią sam na sam.
Tuklin was not caught after his first attack, and more troubling was that his violent fantasy of subduing a woman and sexually molesting her had not been fully satisfied. So 2 months later, in January, armed with a hammer, he struck again.
It's cold, wet, snowing, isolated, and he's literally hunting for prey. The second attack, he hits the woman again on the head with a hammer, and then again is interrupted. So you've got these first two attacks, which are effectively coitus interruptus. The fulfillment hasn't actually happened, and so he's thinking this must be completed.
The woman survived, but was seriously injured by the perverse assault. 4 weeks later, on February the 12th, 1976, Tuklin attacked again. His third victim managed to get away too, but not before Tuklin injured and traumatized her. The sexual predator had now developed a modus operandi that was as cruel as it was simple.
His MO was quite basic and quite brutal, so he would go out equipped with a hammer that he would wrap cloth around the top of, not to soften the blow, but to stop his stomach from getting cold when he tucked it down his trousers. His approach with his victims was incredibly direct. Some of them he would walk up to and say, "Have sex with me." And clearly that's not going to be met with a particularly warm reception.
When he was rejected, Tuklin turned violent.
He liked to chase his victims. He didn't just want to overcome them straight away. He wanted, I guess you'd call it the thrill of the chase. It would prolong the pleasure for him and obviously the distress for his victim.
Then Tuklin would attack the woman with a hammer.
Which, in a way, gave him a perfect MO, because that person from that point on would not be any trouble, would not scream, would not draw attention, and they would be exactly what he wanted, a passive, motionless female that he could sexually gratify himself with.
Sometimes he'd completely obliterate their face. That is often a very personal style of killing. It's taking away somebody's identity when you're attacking their face in that way. So he probably felt quite resentful towards his victims.
Subdued, Tuklin would then sexually assault the women. In his first few attacks, he did not kill his victims. Instead, he left them severely injured and clinging to life. But then, at the end of 1976, Tuklin's attacks on women in and around Gdansk suddenly ceased. That was because Tuklin had been arrested for something very different.
His attacking of women comes to a stop because he's been imprisoned from 1976 until 1979. He's in jail for theft from his workplace.
Tuklin was caught stealing tools and served 3 years. When he was released in the summer of 1979, he got a labouring job. He was in charge of distributing tools at a company that repaired railway rolling stock. With his weapon of choice easily available at the ZNTK factory where he now worked, it was only a matter of time before Tuklin struck again.
He doesn't start out as a killer, but the inevitable outcome of that desire is that the attacks escalate. And they escalate, obviously, into murder.
He was developing into a bit of a hunter, a bit of a predator. He came to figure out the ways that would be most effective to get what he wanted. So he'd pick locations that were isolated, where there wouldn't be other people around. So if somebody comes along and they're a woman and they're on their own, then they're potentially one of his victims.
On November the 9th, 1979, Tuklin caught a bus to Leszno, a village about 10 miles outside of Gdansk, where he went out hunting for his next victim.
This was not a situation like before, when he just wanted to expose himself or masturbate. With a hammer tucked in his belt, he was actively looking for a victim.
Irena, a 20-year-old nurse, was walking home when she was spotted by Tuklin.
She was walking alone. He was getting closer and closer to her. He already had his penis exposed. She turned towards him, but he just attacked her with a hammer.
We're talking about 15 hammer blows to the head. Every one of those is going to lacerate the scalp, potentially fracture the skull. By the time you've got through 15 blows, it is going to be quite a horrific sight. There's going to be severe damage.
Once he was sure that Irena had been subdued, Tuklin dragged her into some nearby bushes.
The girl was still alive. She moved her hands and she tried to bend her legs. These were the unconditioned reflexes after severe damage to her head. Dozens of hammer hits caused the base of her skull to fracture.
Tuklin then sexually assaulted the woman while she was still alive.
His feelings of power come from making others powerless, and there is no kind of sense of respect for his victims. They are literally just sex dolls for him that just lie there whilst he does what he wants, and he doesn't give a damn whether they live or they die. As long as he gets what he wants at that particular given time, then he's happy.
When Tuklin was done, he got dressed, wiped the blood off the hammer, and walked away.
He left this woman lying there in the field.
The 20-year-old nurse, Irena, was Tuklin's first murder victim.
Irena Umarła około tam 1:00, 2:00 w nocy.
Irena died at 1 or 2 a.m. She was found next morning. There was no chance anybody could save her.
But as Tuklin fled the scene of the crime, he made a major mistake. As he tried to leap over a stream, he dropped the hammer.
He suddenly stopped, and then the hammer dropped out of his hand and fell into the water.
The police searched the crime scene the next day and soon found the hammer. It was lying in shallow water.
Irena's killing could be a breakthrough moment of the investigation. There was a sign on it, ZNTK, for the rolling stock maintenance and construction factory.
The police interviewed workers at the factory where Tuklin was in charge of handing out the tools. But because Tuklin had stolen the hammer he used in the attack, his name was not on the list of people who checked out hammers that week. So Tuklin slipped through the net, and that would prove costly. In 1980, Paweł Tuklin moved back to the village of Góra in northern Poland, where he was born. Here, 40 miles from Gdansk, and now living on a farm, the man who had attacked 4 women with a hammer and killed 1 was hiding in plain sight. On the surface, 34-year-old Tuklin was living an ordinary life. He even remarried and had a second child. But his wife seemed oblivious to his heinous activities.
I think he kept them reasonably well hidden in that he went out, during the night and at times when he might not be missed that easily.
He explained he had some extra jobs. He said that apart from his regular job, he made extra money working for private individuals.
All the while, Tuklin's deadly desires had not abated and in fact were growing stronger. It would only be a matter of time before he attacked again.
There's always going to be something in the background that is unresolved in him. He's always going to feel that resentment and that bitterness towards people who marginalised him growing up.
One of the problems where someone engages in this kind of attack on females for a sexual purpose is that the repetitive nature becomes a little bit mundane once it's been done a few times. To add excitement, to add more kind of stimulation to it, those attacks became more and more vicious and more often deadly.
On the 1st of February 1980, Tuklin was once again on the hunt when he spotted 30-year-old Anastasia walking home. With a cloth-bound hammer tucked into his trousers, Tuklin approached the young woman. When she rejected his advances, he ruthlessly struck. While his victim lay dying, Tuklin helped himself to all that he wanted.
Tuklin actually did, after he had managed to gratify himself, rummage through the bags and belongings of the victims. He will have taken things, the odd trophy that he could actually use as some kind of reminder of the event itself. But he also almost engaged in a kind of post-sex celebratory meal. He would take any food that was left and he would eat it whilst actually watching that female die, bleed, be in agony.
Here's somebody who doesn't care about the suffering or the pain of other people. He'll take the lunch of one of his victims and he'll sit there eating it while she's fighting for her life, because it's all about him and his own survival and his own needs and his own desires.
Anastasia was Tuklin's second murder victim. In 5 years, 3 of which were spent in prison, Tuklin brutally attacked 9 women. By the end of 1980, Tuklin had killed a total of 6 women and was about to murder many more.
On the map, you can see the spread of the crimes. In the beginning, when Paweł Tuklin lived with his first wife in Gdansk, he attacked in the suburbs of the city. After 1980, when he moved to Góra, the attacks were there. He moved by bus, by train, or by stolen car.
Dojeżdżał pociągiem albo kradzionym samochodem i kolejne ataki mamy w tych miejscowościach.
And the following attacks in these towns were along the car route.
Samochodowej.
With the communist government preoccupied with the uprising that had begun in September 1980 and led by the labor union known as Solidarność, few resources were allocated to murder investigations. That meant Tuklin was able to strike with impunity. In all, he would kill 9 women before he could be caught.
It was a big embarrassment for the police to admit that there was a serial killer in the communist country. The serial killers could exist in the USA, in the UK, or in the Rotten West, as Western Europe was called back then. Not in a beautiful communist country like Poland.
But when on December the 8th, 1982, Tuklin attacked a woman next to the local Communist Party headquarters, everything changed.
There was a big fog on that day. The temperature in Skarszeva was approximately 0, and the town was surrounded by a fog so thick that there was no visibility.
In what were perfect conditions for the sexual predator, Tuklin saw 26-year-old Bożena, a local factory worker, walking home alone.
He saw she was petite. Bożena was a slight woman. When he was close, he simply attacked her.
After he hit her in the head with the hammer and knocked her out, Tuklin dragged her to some nearby bushes where he continued his attack. But Bożena was still alive. Residents in an apartment complex nearby later reported hearing her cries for help.
The residents heard the voice, "Mum, Mummy," the voice of a girl, some moans coming from the bushes. But no one really knew what was going on. Tuklin started to undress Bożena. In the meantime, she woke up several times, said something, started begging for help. He hit her with a hammer again. After the first hit, Bożena woke up at least twice, as he described it later.
When he was done satisfying himself, Tuklin left the fatally injured Bożena to die. But this time he made a mistake that would eventually put an end to his serial killing spree. As the murder happened next door to the local Communist Party headquarters, the mass murders could no longer be ignored by the regime.
Bożena died next to the headquarters of the ruling Communist Party. That fact put huge pressure on the authorities. They wanted to solve this case somehow.
In January 1983, a new police task force was set up to find the serial killer. At that point, Tuklin had attacked 16 women with a hammer. Called Scorpion, the team was so named for the way Tuklin struck his victims.
It's kind of appropriate, the idea of the sudden striking motion that you're not expecting. You can imagine a scorpion moving like that.
One of the commanders of the special unit was Stanislav Szek.
Our group had the support of the whole police force in the entire area. In fact, the information connected with this case was flooding in from different directions.
After matching murders committed in the same way, the task force quickly worked out they were dealing with one serial killer and sexual predator. A key detective on the Scorpion team was Andrzej Gawrysz.
In terms of those first pieces of evidence, we can say that on those specific crime scenes, similar tools seem to be used to attack the victims.
do zaatakowania ofiar. Według pracowników, którzy zajmowali się,
People who worked on those cases had a stronger and stronger belief that all these murders were committed by one person.
jedna osoba. Wskazywał na to sposób działania sprawcy.
The hunt for the so-called Scorpion Killer was now on.
I think he would have been well aware of the coverage of these crimes and the fact that he was branded the Scorpion. Here's somebody who's been marginalised and isolated and excluded their entire lives, and now they're this pseudo-celebrity. Now everybody is talking about them. And I think that would have made him feel quite powerful.
With the task force fully engaged in stopping the Scorpion, the net was closing in on the serial killer. Paweł Tuklin was living on the family farm in the village of Góra, some 40 miles from Gdansk in Poland. He had so far attacked 16 women and killed 8 using a hammer. But he was about to make a mistake that would lead to his capture. On the 28th of February, Tuklin stole a van and was driving near the small town of Lubihovo when he spotted some piglets at a local farm.
Tuklin saw there was some piglets in the pigsty. He drove to the back, loaded the piglets and arrived home unnoticed. He told his wife he got the piglets for a job he did instead of money. He put the piglets into the pigsty, built a fence, spent some time at home and then went hunting again.
Tuklin's criminality, be it theft, murder or sexual assault, now consumed his life.
He wasn't just a sexual predator, he was a thief. He stole a van, and as he was driving the van, he sees a woman walking along the road, and I think he sees an opportunity there, and he decides, right, well, I want her.
Early the next morning, on March the 1st, Tuklin had his next victim in his sights. 25-year-old Wiesława was an accountant and was getting ready to go to work at the local state collective farm. When she left her house, Tuklin followed her in his van. Then, when he was sure no one was around, he sped up.
When Tuklin saw a woman walking along the side of the road, he sharply pulled over and hit her. She lost consciousness.
Tuklin put her in the back of the van and drove to some secluded woods nearby.
There, he took a hammer and began striking her. He left her completely annihilated.
And then everything does start to unravel because he's changed his MO. This isn't the usual hammer attack that he uses. And I think at this point in time, he feels like he's pretty invincible. Nobody's caught up with him yet.
But as Tuklin was trying to drive away, the van got stuck in the mud. Tuklin then decided to assault the woman. He got her out of the van and viciously attacked her. When he was done, Tuklin left his victim, Wiesława, to die in the field while he abandoned the van and left for home.
Wiesława was really lucky. She survived despite being hit with a hammer.
Though seriously injured, Wiesława was able to give the police who were called to the scene a description of the man who attacked her. At the same time, the police found pig feces in the back of the abandoned van. With that evidence, they determined the attacker must have been from the country and not the city. But the biggest clue that would lead the Scorpion task force to capture the killer was the fact that he could drive. In the 1980s, being able to drive in Poland was still a rarity. Commander Stanislav Sziak himself searched through the records of people in the area with a driver's license.
I remember it like it was yesterday. We requested the records of all people who had a driving license from the areas in which he attacked and murdered people. We asked for people between ages 25 and 40.
które posiadają prawo jazdy w wieku od 25 do 40.
Then Stanislav cross-checked the list of people with a driver's license against the records of known criminals.
Ataki to ataki.
It was a list of crimes committed by a man named Paweł Tuchlin.
Z kartoteki policyjnej. Aha, nazywa się Paweł Tuchlin, ale tu
There was something about thefts. He stole some things.
Kradł to owo tamto.
When the detective requested a mugshot and compared it to the 8 photo fit sketches given by some of the survivors, Stanislav had his eureka moment.
When I saw it, when I saw what he looked like, it was a dream come true. It was a compilation of all the photo fits we already had from the witness testimonies. Well, this information, joined by the fact he had a license, gave me the shivers.
What is more, from the driver's license records, the investigators found Tuchlin's home address. But before the Scorpion task force could get their man, Tuchlin struck again. On the 6th of May 1983, Jolanta, a 19-year-old seamstress, was on her way home. Tuchlin approached her, and when she refused his crude advances, he hit her with a hammer and then sexually assaulted her. Jolanta died from the awful injuries she'd been subjected to. She was Tuchlin's 9th murder victim. But when Tuchlin succumbed once again to petty theft and stole a large pig cooker from the farm next door, the task force closed in. Once he realized who stole the cooker, Tuchlin's neighbor called the police.
I think at this point in time, he does feel like he can do whatever he likes, that the authorities are never going to catch up with him.
On the 31st of May 1983, 3 weeks after his last murder, the police arrived to finally arrest 37-year-old Paweł Tuchlin.
When we saw Paweł, the 4 of us were sat in the car and we all thought, it must be him, it must be him.
The police approached Tuchlin when they already knew he was a murderer. But the cooker was a pretext to arrest him. They handcuffed him, and you don't do this for such a petty crime.
They took Tuchlin in, and Andrzej led the questioning.
The interrogation lasted around 4.5 hours, but Paweł stayed calm throughout the whole thing. At first, he didn't want to talk. He said he didn't remember. We were asking him about specific places and specific dates. And step by step, Paweł began to reveal the truth.
A leading Polish forensic expert, Adrian Wrocławski, analysed the case.
Following Tuchlin's arrest, and during the search of his property, where a lot of evidence was secured, the officers found his shoes in the cupboard of his electrical workshop.
When they found the murder weapon too, a blood-stained hammer, Tuchlin's fate was sealed.
Once Tuchlin was actually confronted with evidence, he knew the game was up. He knew that he may as well confess. He may as well sort of get it off his chest, if you like, but most of all, probably be able at last to brag about it.
Then, in an extraordinary move, the police took Tuchlin back to the scenes of his crimes and had him reenact the attacks.
He was so excited by these events that during the investigation, he often said he could show more during the reconstructions.
Więcej będziemy w stanie pokazać na wizji lokalnej I prosił nawet, gdzie były praktykantki.
And he even asked, as there were legal apprentices there, to get the younger girls so he could demonstrate it better as they turned him on.
Lepiej by było zagrane.
Not only was he reliving what he'd done, he was also kind of showing off to all these fairly indifferent individuals exactly what he had done. And he was to some degree proud of it, because those were his sexual conquests.
On the 5th of May 1985, Tuchlin's trial for the murder of 9 women began at the provincial courthouse in Gdansk. But even though he'd confessed to it all, in court he pulled a major surprise.
Up until then, he pleaded guilty of the charges, as well as actively taking part in the visits to the crime scenes. But after the reading of his indictment, he pleaded not guilty. He said that he was forced to confess, that there was an agreement between him and the militia officers. If he confessed, he would spend 3 years under observation in a psychiatric unit, but then he would be free to go and enjoy his life.
But the jury did not buy his defense. On August the 6th, 1985, Pavel Tuklin was found guilty of 9 murders and 11 attempted murders. He was sentenced to death.
The number of victims, the amount of suffering and the endless tears that he caused allow us for sure to consider him one of the world's most evil killers.
On May the 25th, 1987, nearly 12 years after his first attack, Pavel Tuklin was executed for his crimes.
He was sentenced to death by hanging, and as he was being led to the end, he really was kicking off. He was giving his guards a very hard time of it. And you often see this with killers who are given the death sentence. They have a last vestige of power here. They can control what happens in relation to their death, and he wasn't going to go quietly.
At the end, this was the last shocking thing. The prosecutor asked him what he would do if he was released. Pavel replied, "Well, I'd probably go for another hunt."
We did this. We worked this case for the memory of these girls who were always on my mind.
Thanks to the dedication of the detectives on the case, Tuklin's 8-year reign of terror in and around Gdansk and northern Poland was finally stopped. But the brutality of the crimes, sexually assaulting and killing 9 women, and the attempted murder of 11 more, makes Pavel Tuklin one of the world's most evil killers.